Graeme Rendall is a serial author, UAP researcher, and aviation historian. He's written numerous books about both of those passions, and is perfectly suited to be able to cast a more critical eye on UFOs. He's doing the hard work of digging into the archives and finding new cases, so that we don't have to. So Graeme, to start us off, tell me a little bit about your background and how you became interested in the UFO phenomenon.
So I was an aviation enthusiast before I was a UFO enthusiast. My mother started buying me model kits of airplanes when I was about 4 years old to keep me quiet. Cool. Started looking at the instructions, and they had little potted histories of each aircraft. So that developed into a kind of passion for aviation and aircraft, reading up as much as I can from the libraries, etc. But I started moving into science fiction as well at about sort of 8 or 9, reading Isaac Asimov books, which had nice pictures of spacecraft on the front. And my mother, bless her, thought she was doing me a favor one day, and she brought this book into the house that she bought me, and she thought it was another one of the series of Asimov novels, and it had a picture of a flying saucer on the front, but it was by a UFO author, and it was about UFOs. And me being a sponge for a lot of scientific and spacecraft and this kind of things back then, it was just like catnip, and I got straight into it, read that book, wanted to read more, sort of cleaned the library out of all their books in their UFO section, and just amassed more and more knowledge as through my teens. So yeah, that's how it all started.
Cool. Before you got that book then, the one that your mum thought was Asimov but wasn't Asimov,
yeah,
had you kind of been reading those books thinking, oh, this could be true, some of this could be true, and like being open-minded to that kind of stuff? Or were you very much, this is fantasy?
I think a lot of the stuff I was reading was obviously based on kind of futuristic concepts, so it didn't necessarily bring the sort of stories about aliens. So Asimov had much more human dimensions to a lot of his stories. He didn't really deal with kind of bug-eyed monsters as such, but some of the other things I was reading did sort of touch on those aspects. So I guess maybe watching things like the original versions of Star Trek back then as well, and some other science fiction that obviously you couldn't get away from as a kid. I think the seeds have been planted already for me having an interest in what are the possibilities of us being the only kind of life in the universe, etc., and those larger concepts. So I must have been primed somehow for that.
And since then, has it been kind of 50-50 with the aviation enthusiasm and the unidentified aviation enthusiasm, or how has that kind of split been?
Oh, they've become less or more as years have gone on. I think when I got to the end of my teens, the aviation took over, because I became briefly an editor of an amateur aviation magazine for a little while, for a couple of years, and I did some foreign trips looking at airplanes, including Russia and some other places. So that took over through my 20s. But then sort of that waned a bit as well, because as we were talking a little bit off camera before about how you can get too deep into subjects sometimes, and it's quite healthy to step back and do something else occasionally. So other interests took over. I did some, I was into hill walking for a bit as well, and I think you sometimes re-examine things occasionally that you've sort of fell away from, in past years. And I remember picking up a book in a shop about UFOs again and thinking, oh yeah, I had an interest in that once upon a time, and then just getting back into it for a bit. But I think it wasn't until those videos surfaced again in 2017, in December 2017, that it really sort of kicked in again. Because before that, to me, I mean, this is just my opinion, but to me, back in the late 90s and through the early 2000s, the subject was a bit in the doldrums, and some of the UFO magazines that were available in the UK back in the 90s seemed to be quite becoming much more sensationalized in terms of what coverage they had, and it was almost like an early form of clickbait to me, and it didn't necessarily root itself too much in fact. There wasn't much it didn't seem to be much research. It was all, we'll just throw out see what sticks kind of thing. It's a bit like Facebook nowadays. You read a lot of stuff on Facebook, and it's very, very little of it seems to be fact driven. It's all conjecture, some fairly bad analysis, in my opinion, and just some big leaps of faith in terms of what seems to be real, what is just made up. And I felt back then that the magazines and and this is obviously before internet, but a lot of that was going that way, and it sort of took me away from it. because I'm quite sort of data driven, I'm quite factual driven. I don't necessarily make huge leaps of logic, and I just felt that it was going in the wrong direction. So yeah, I drifted away from it. But when people started releasing things that you could look at and go, oh, right, that's really interesting, and coming up with supporting information, all the rest of it, that did sort of, really drag me back in.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, it did the same for me. I don't think I had quite as much kind of history with it before as you. I don't really remember exactly whether, what my opinions were on it, but I think I was kind of on the fence. I was kind of semi-open, to something being potentially going on, but I never really gave it much of a thought, I don't think, until those videos in 2017 and that article. But there's some bizarre media, right? There's some bizarre media coverage. Like, I think of, when you were saying that just then, I think of the Star and things like that, where I remember an article a year or two ago, and I can't even remember how I found it, because I don't read the Star. It was something along the lines of, aliens abducted my husband or my wife and left a space, or turned them into a space raider, something along those lines. They a crisp. They left a crisp or a Mars bar or something in place of this abducted partner. And how do you even react to that?
You read it, it's almost like the old Daily Sport, isn't it? The newspaper, well, you put inverted commas around that, and it had, what was it, World War II bomber found on moon. That was their famous headline. And you just shake your head, really, and just move on to the next, clickbait kind of story. And I think it's more entertainment. They're not really news stories. They're just there to be entertaining and to make people laugh. I don't think there's any particular news in it. And yes, okay, this chap might have thought that his wife had been abducted and turned into a small crisp, but there'll be some other truth somewhere behind that particular story. But it sells newspapers, doesn't it? So there you go.
And I would be almost certain that the author of those articles has never actually spent as much as 5 minutes researching the topic, right? It's
no.
Based purely on stigma. Tell me a little bit more about your aviation enthusiasm, love, and history, and what you've done in that field, because obviously puts you in a fascinating position to be a kind of commentator on UFOs and looking into this subject, because you're so familiar with the stuff that's supposed to be, or that we know is in our skies and that we're familiar with, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the interest obviously started early, as I said, and just grew in terms of reading a lot, but also going to see a lot of aviation, because I lived in Newcastle back when I was young, and I was really close to where the airport was. The approach to the airport, at least one end of the runway, was very close to where I lived, so you could see airplanes going in. I used to see them flying over the school field when I was young. So you got exposed quite early. I was taken to air shows quite a lot every year, either local ones or national ones. So my father didn't mind driving. And if we were on holiday down in Cornwall each year, that's where we used to go. It was always timed to coincide with a couple of the major air shows on a naval base and an RAF base down there. So you're seeing a lot. And then, of course, when I became more independent and when I'd be able to drive, et cetera, and I was traveling around Europe on my own, a lot of that would coincide with either going to airports to see what was happening, or going to museums. And then there was organized trips would be set up. You see adverts in the back of aviation magazines, and this is just before and just after the wall came down in 91. They were just starting to open up. Even before the end of communism, it was easier to get around Eastern Europe. But when the wall came down at the end of 91, the floodgates opened, and there was a lot of trips, organized photography trips around what had been the Warsaw Pact and around their air bases. So I remember walking around a Czechoslovakian Air Force base in June 1992. I remember going off to Russia the following month and traveling around northeastern Siberia in chartered Aeroflot airliners, looking at remote airstrips in the middle of nowhere, photographing airplanes out there. So it was an interesting time. So yeah, I think I accomplished quite a bit, and certainly things that other people hadn't managed. But there was a lot of us doing the same kind of things, different parts of the world at this time, at that time, because it was getting easier to fly. I had friends that went around South America doing the same kind of thing. People were going around North America, Africa. I had a friend that went to Syria before it became rather dangerous to go there. So there was, myself and other people were really kind of expanding our knowledge and our experience in terms of aviation. I didn't get to learn to fly. I found it was too expensive to do so, but I was really busy in researching historical aviation, but mostly where I lived, which I'd moved out in Northumberland, and I started to write magazine articles about various crashes and other incidents and all the rest of it. And not only do I now write books about UFOs, but I write books about airfields, the history of various airfields and things like that. I've managed to publish one, and I've got one that I'm working on at the moment. So yeah, the interest, sort of, I guess now is parallel with the UFO side. And as you mentioned, I might not be maybe the world's greatest commentator on aviation or UFOs, but it's nice that I can link the two. And I've got information that I've amassed over the years that I can use when talking about UFOs. So yeah, it's quite nice to have not a unique insight, but something that maybe not everybody who does look at the study of UFOs has.
Yeah. Definitely rare, if not unique. But no, it must really help. How often do you kind of look at a video of somebody saying, "Oh, what is this UFO that I've seen?" And you're like, "Oh, okay, it's this aircraft, X, Y, and Z aircraft." Or does that happen frequently?
It has done in the past. People have shown pictures of things that they're not entirely sure about, and to me, it looks like it might look like an airplane of some description, just from a different angle, or they'll mention about stories of things that have happened, and you'll find that there might have been a military exercise then, and therefore it's more likely that something that happened during that particular operation, that exercise, sort of generated some kind of light display or something like that, which can explain what happened. But of course, there are genuine unknowns, things that people do show that you just can't. You go, yeah, hold my hands up. I just simply don't know what that is, and I'm not going to just throw out things for the hell of it. If I don't know what something is, I either just keep quiet. If I haven't been asked, or if I have been asked, I'll generate an opinion and say, yeah, I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Yeah. I find that I don't make up things just for the hell of it, or to sell a newspaper story, or to sell a book. It's not worth it. In the end, you tend to get found out. So and I've seen other people go down those roads before, and it doesn't get you anywhere.
No, absolutely not. I think you've chosen the correct path there. What was the first book you wrote on kind of any topic, on either the aviation? I know it was an aviation book. So what was the first?
It was about my trip to Siberia in June '92. So that came out beginning of last year. And obviously it was quite a long time in the making, but and I'd written a series of magazine articles for the magazine I used to sort of help to edit back in the early 2000s. But it wasn't that much in terms. It was more sort of focused towards aircraft enthusiasts than a general audience. Whereas when I wrote the book, it was three ways basically. It was more like a travelogue. There was stuff about historical aspects of the place I went to, and then there was the aircraft. So I wrote the book for different audiences, if you like. So hopefully that people who bought it, depending on where they sat along those three areas, they could get something out of the book, and it wasn't just a narrow focus.
Cool. And you've now got that book plus the 3 UFO books. So there's 4 books published. So you hadn't published anything 2 years ago, a year and a half ago?
No. No. And now I've got 11 or something now, I think. So.
Oh, 11.
Yeah. I've written a few other aviation books, and a couple of, there's a French language and a Spanish language version of the Foo-Fighters book I wrote last year.
Wow. So the other aviation history ones, are they more focused on, like you said, airfields, or is any of them?
There's a history of an airfield in Northumberland, and then there's 3 books about just various incidents that have happened in Northumberland since the late 1700s, ballooning, things like that. So, and bringing right through the modern day. So those are the other books I've written, apart from the other UFO books that you mentioned before.
Yeah. Have you ever ended up including like some kind of UFO related incident that took place at an airfield in one of the aviation enthusiast books?
At the moment, I've managed to stay away from that, but you've actually put an idea in my head, so you never know what might happen in the future.
Yeah. There's got to be some overlap where
There's definitely crossover the other way, because it's much easier to be able to apply the kind of aviation knowledge to the UFO subject. The other way is much more difficult, I think, because the places I've written about so far don't really have any kind of things to my knowledge in terms of UFO events.
Yeah,
But that's not to say I might find one in the future about something I'm writing about. So yeah,
absolutely.
I'll store that one away. Thank you very much, Ben.
Nice. So the first UFO book was UFOs Before Roswell, European
Yeah.
Foo-Fighters, 1940 to 1945. Tell me about how and when you decided to write it and what the process was. First of all, coming up with the plan and then with actually executing it.
So I think for years I was aware of the Foo Fighters, not just the name of the band, but actually what their relevance was in terms of the UFO subject.
Yeah.
And from about 1945 right through to about the mid-90s, there'd always been this kind of very, very small amount of information about what they were. And therefore, they were almost like a footnote, an afterthought in many UFO books that I'd read during the 70s, during the 80s. But I couldn't help think there was more that we weren't seeing for whatever reason. And then when the 90s came along, people started being able to lodge FOIA requests and look through various historical archives for the first time in America. And they did actually manage to dig out some further information. It wasn't a huge amount, but there certainly was information there. I remember reading a book that was published in 2007 called A Strange Company. It was written by an American called Keith Chester. And it was a kind of general view of the European and the Pacific War in terms of the Foo Fighters, in terms of these mystery lights that followed aircraft, but it's also other things as well that have been seen in the skies. But I mean, I spoke to Keith as well, and he agrees that it was a kind of work in progress. There was more that needed to be done on the book, and unfortunately, there was some mistakes crept into it. And I felt that being an aircraft enthusiast and knowing a fair bit about the war and about German secret weapons, there was still another book to be written here, and about the subject, but also because a lot of people was just suggesting various strange things, things that were to explain the Foo Fighters in the shape of German secret weapons. Now, I realized that probably couldn't be true for a variety of reasons, which I go into in the book. But nobody had really written anything that categorically went through all the various reasons, all the various kind of explanations that people have come forward with, all these crazy ones, and refuted them. So that was the book I felt I should write. And then it was just a question of sitting down and planning how I was going to do it. But at the same time, I had the idea that I should go through the RAF squadron records for the bomber units that were operating over Germany during the war, just to see whether there was any further information that had never appeared. And actually, it turns out there was loads. So that all made it into the book. So it was a question of fitting all that in, but telling a story that was able to be read and understood by people who weren't necessarily aviation enthusiasts or even UFO enthusiasts, because you have to remember that there might be people who pick your book up who aren't necessarily that interested, but they just like a good story to read. Yeah. So it was literally a question of planning it out, and coming up with the British and the American sightings first, and then going through the various kind of crackpot explanations that appeared over the years, actually since the 1950s, and going through them one by one and just refuting them, but not just refuting them in terms of opinion, because you see a lot of that, this toing and froing about, oh yeah, I think that, no, they're not that, this is because, but actually going through and doing a proper analysis of the claims, and then finding information to counter them, and finding where the root of the claims appears from, because sometimes the claims themselves were based on false information, or they were based on no information whatsoever. So you had to dig back, and it was a bit of a historical kind of analysis that way as well. It wasn't just me just making things up at the top of my head. And then the next thing was to actually document all these things with footnotes as well. So if anybody reads the Foo Fighters book, they'll find there's over 1,100 footnotes, and they're all sources. So there's not just one thing at the back of the book that says, oh, this is where I've pulled all the information from. It goes all the way through the book. So people can what I suppose I call it checking my homework, if you like. They can see what I've done, and they can see where I've got that information from, and they can see the context it is in the first place. So it's not me cherry picking information to suit a narrative that I've come up with. And I don't like when I see that either. I don't like. I've never liked that in other people's books. I'm not mentioning names here, but these are books from a long time ago, and I don't like to see that. And I'd rather just, and as I've done in this book and others, put information out there, and at the end of the day, say, look, this is what I've got. Look at it yourself, and analyze it for yourself, and see what you come up with as well. And I think that's a fair way to do it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds fascinating. I always heard about the Foo-Fighters, and never really, like you said, there was never really that much information, kind of readily available for people that weren't maybe really deep into this topic. I mean, maybe there was for people that were really deep in, like you said, you read some stuff about it. But yeah, I never really heard that much, but I was always fascinated about it. How many reports did you come across, like in total? Do you know how many?
Hundreds.
Hundreds.
There were maybe 100 or so, or maybe a few more than that, in terms of before I started digging through the records that were already out there. As you mentioned before, people who were more kind of deep into this topic were aware of some other information, but actually the sum total wasn't that much, and a lot of it was just kind of recycled recycled information from what was already there. And the books basically just used the same core information of about 12 different sightings, but there were some more, and they did filter through eventually, but you had to know where to look, and they were never really in one place apart from that previous book I mentioned before. But when I started looking through the squadron histories, particularly the RAF ones, there were just tons of them. You just had to know which squadrons to look at, and you had to work out where they were operating, and that was easy enough done as far as I was concerned, because I knew who operated where and with what type of aircraft and what years, etc. So it was a question of just looking through the National Archives and through their squadron records. You were limited. I think I was limited to 100 records a month, so I had to take it easy because I was quickly overrunning the kind of amount of information I could get from the archives digitally. I didn't have to go down there; it was all free. So of course I was doing this through COVID, so it was quite good. I didn't have to travel down to London. Each time I wanted to get information, I could do it over the internet and just ask them to send me information. And then it was just a question of going through all these, records that were dating from 1942, 1943, 1944, etc. But it helped having an aviation background and somebody who was interested in the wartime aspects of that to be able to understand what was being said as well, because they're not, they're written in jargon sometimes, so it's not just plain English. So you have, and also you got to filter that out as well with the kind of German technology of the time to look at something and say, well, that doesn't, that looks really strange. That's not what either is being said or something that's run of the mill. So then you look at that a bit closer and then try and find some other information as well to maybe back it up. And that's just how I worked through all these. And it took me about 7 months to get through it all. So yeah, wow. It was it was a very interesting and it was a very interesting time, because I thought at the outset, well, I'm going to look through these archives and I'm probably not going to find much more than what's there already, because I presume that the guys beforehand had done a pretty thorough job, which of course they had with the American records, but not so much with the British, as I found out, because I pulled out lots and lots, and it all went in the book. And I thought, I'm not going to leave any of this out. It's too good. It's too good to miss.
Awesome. And do you know there's been researchers that have done the same job on the German records? Are there are reports from Germans too, right?
Well, this is the thing. There's a lot of people have come to me either as a result of the book or beforehand and saying, well, the Germans saw these things too, and anecdotal evidence in terms of that statement being said in previous on previous websites and in certain kind of publications. But then you get no information about that side of things. And really, I came to a dead end, because there is some information, and it's very sketchy, about German sightings, but not on the same kind of level as the Americans or the British. Now, there might be reasons for that, because a lot of the Luftwaffe records were destroyed at the end of the war for certain years, but quite a lot remains. And it appears to me, from what I've managed to find out, that nobody's really gone through the German records. that remain to the kind of depth or to the extent that I think we've done with the RAF ones.
Yeah.
Or if they have, that information has never been released because I couldn't find it anywhere. Yes, okay, it'll be in German, more likely. However, I've not come across somebody who says, look, I've gone through all these Luftwaffe records and I've found this and I've found that and I've found the other. It just doesn't exist. So unless somebody's keeping it quiet and they're due to release it at some stage, to me, it hasn't been done yet. There is, I think I found about half a dozen, maybe 10 instances of information, but it was quite vague in terms of there were no unit names, and so you couldn't try and dig out these squadron records from the German side and try and see whether it was true or not. And the information that you found that was appearing in certain books, very esoteric books as well, turned out in some respects to be wrong, because the things they were saying about the particular cases couldn't have been true. And just by how they were describing it about in terms of aircrafts that were allegedly a certain location at a certain time in the war, or what they were doing, because either they didn't have the capability to climb as high as was being suggested, or those aircraft weren't actually in that theater of war at the time. So there were things that made me go, okay, and actually did this analysis when I wrote the book. I looked at these claims and said, well, this is where this claim was written down. I've looked at it and this is why it can't have happened. And here's the reason why. Was it something else or is it just a complete mistake? Or is it a hoax? And actually, in terms of the German side, there is one proper hoax because a French author came up with one in the 1970s. He put it out there to see whether other writers were plagiarizing his work. And he admitted to the hoax in 1982. So, there are things that have been put out as fact and are still trotted out as fact even now in the 2020s, and yet were dismissed as and actually admitted to as hoax 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So yeah, people have to be very careful about what they read on not just the Foo-Fighters, but much wider in the much wider UFO kind of subject, because not everything you do read somewhere is true, for that very reason.
Or probably just every subject these days.
Well, that's true as well. Yes, very true.
So in your kind of aviation expert opinion, without giving any or too many book spoilers, what do you kind of conclude? Were these some kind of plane, or were they, talk to me about that.
So, I mean, I think I'll start that by paraphrasing. I'm not an expert in and
compared to me, you are.
I've been quoted as that in the Sun and the Star, and it's really when I've had things published in there.
Enthusiast.
That's much better. Yeah, I'm interested. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So if you use that caveat, then and my kind of feelings about what these things were, well, it's no secret because I've mentioned this before in other podcasts. I simply don't know, Ben. I can say what they're not because that was the thrust of the book, and I think it was better to come from that angle to say, look, they're not German secret weapons because of X, Y, and Z, or they're not other Allied aircraft because, again, for the reasons why I go into in the book. And therefore that knocks out these things. So then you're left with other questions which I can't answer. I can't say they're the A word, aliens, because we don't have the evidence to support that. Equally, we don't have the evidence to say they're not that.
Yeah.
Are they time travelers from the future? Well, yes, okay, you can't rule that out either. Are they some, I don't know, what they call ultra-terrestrials, races of other people who live with us, but we can't comprehend them, we can't see them visually, or we may coexist, but we are not aware of them. Again, that's something else I can't rule out. But I don't go down those alleys because I can't find information to back those kind of theories up. Other people have come up with those, but that's not something I do. I'd leave that for somebody else to write about in that kind of respect. I guess what I think are my strengths is to analyze something and say what it isn't, because then that leaves the door open for other possibilities and for people to then think about those. And I think, if I was to start conjecturing and writing about things that I'm not entirely sure about and I can't prove, that would just end up with something that I've read before, and which I always think, I don't like that. Yeah. And I don't want to be accused of doing that, either by other people or my future self.
No, it makes sense. Maybe I should have phrased it as, okay, so as an aviation enthusiast, we've got enthusiasts. So as an aviation enthusiast, what did they kind of fit into any box that you're familiar with? Could you have said, okay, I think there's a fair chance it could have been something to do with this aircraft or this or this? Was there anything that was familiar about it? Or in terms of prosaic explanations, are we thinking about like next level German technology?
Oh, we're
or...
thinking of things even beyond what the Germans were considering. Even the things that they were considering and couldn't build themselves because they didn't have the technology or the time, or both. I'll just throw one out straight away for you. So the cover of the book actually is, an alleged real kind of encounter, and there was this orange kind of like light that came up behind this bomber in March 1942, and the tail gunner fired at it, and the bullets just went into the light and nothing happened. The light then moved around to the wingtip of the aircraft, and the gunners were shooting it as it went round, and then it moved around to the nose of the aircraft, and the nose gunners started firing at it as well, and then it just flew off. Now, if that had been a German night fighter or some kind of German technology, then all those bullets either striking it or sort of going into it would have it would have damaged it at the very least, but probably destroyed it. So, but nothing happened. It just shot off into the skies. So, that's not German technology, because everything that we understand about what they were working on either exists in terms of there's footage of it, or there are bits of it in museums, etc., and this kind of thing, or there are plans. And the plans may not have been turned into actual, sort of real life objects, but at least there's information to say, they were thinking about building this. They never got round to it for reason X, Y, or Z. So we know these are tangible things. We know that Germans were working on certain things, either realized or just projected, but nothing actually matches the kind of descriptions of things or lights or other objects that were seen over Europe during World War II. Yeah. And therefore, you can't put them into a category other than unexplained. And in some respects, some of these sightings do resemble UFO reports from the 1940s, from the 1950s, etc. So it's maybe not right to say that the kind of June 1947 with Kenneth Arnold was the start of the modern UFO phenomenon, because actually, you look at these reports, it started a bit earlier, a few years earlier.
Yeah. And this was about 80 years ago now, wasn't it? So,
it is, yeah.
So back then, you don't think there was any aircraft, at least that you're aware of, that could have kind of fit with these reports. And I think it's probably fair to say that now in 2022, it's the same case. No, that we wouldn't have any aircraft that could do what you just said, that could be kind of come up as a light behind an airplane and basically be shot at and just continue business as usual.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously things aren't shot at nowadays because they don't do that, but there's still the lights that move around and seem to interact with aircraft and then fly off without any obvious means of propulsion and means of control, and they don't seem to be manned and all the rest of it. That kind of aspect of the similarities are the same as now. And then if you look at the kind of, the dogfighting has been sort of called what happened during the Nimitz encounters in 2004, where the F-18 was going round circles in a kind of dogfight with a tic-tac-shaped object. And there have been sort of encounters with US Navy aircraft over the east and west coast of America, with various strange objects. If you just look at the dogfighting aspect of the Nimitz case, then there are parallels to encounters that happened in 1943. With ones I've written in the book. There were two encounters that year, one over North Africa and one over Italy, where RAF aircraft were going round and round circles with lights following them, trying to get on their tails, and the lights were doing the same to them. And then the lights, after a while, just flew off and disappeared. So there are things, and where they were and what they were doing and the kind of speed and the rest of it, they're not German, because for various reasons, too long to go into here, but to go into in the book. Suffice it to say that a lot of this just couldn't have taken place in terms of German secret weapons or just German aircraft, because either they didn't have the aircraft in place at the time, or the kind of speeds we're talking about were just beyond what they were capable of.
And as far as we know, that's still the case now, and that definitely kind of, it definitely pushes me towards saying there's a good chance it was something non-man-made, right? It's something.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what you take away from it. You, or at least they're not things that we're aware of from back then. And there's always the very, very small possibility that someone somewhere was building something that nobody still knows about. But I think the chances of that kind of happening seem to be so remote that they're practically impossible. But you can't say categorically no, but you can more or less say, yeah, it's 99.9% sure. But then that leaves, to the question as to what they are. And yes, okay, your options are what you said, and the kind of time travelers, the terrestrials, and maybe other things that we just simply don't understand. Or they could have been some kind of Earth phenomenon, like Earth lights. There's a ball lightning in some cases, but not all the Foo-Fighter reports and other craft that were seen were the same thing. There was a variety of things seen during the war. So people saw lights, other people saw things that looked like structured craft. There were like 200-foot long Zeppelin kind type machines, which couldn't have been airships because they were operating in conditions which are much too harsh for kind of airships, I feel like. So yeah, there was a variety of things. Now, were they all, what you mentioned, or other things that I mentioned there? Well, maybe not. But they seem quite diverse. So we're looking at a range of phenomenon which maybe interact with each other, or maybe they're just completely separate. Questions. We seem to have more questions than answers.
Yeah, it's always the way, isn't it? The more we learn, the more questions we have. You just got me thinking about something then when you said about the airships. You must know the answer to this question. When was the first airship put in the sky?
Well, I mean, you're looking at balloons really rather than airships, because lighter than air travel. They were experimenting with that in the late 1700s, and then beyond that, they got a bit more sophisticated in terms of being able to control them. And then there was, well, I suppose I'll flip this on its head and talk about the great airship wave of the late 1890s. People were already experimenting with them back then. Just it seems that whatever people were looking at in terms of the UFO angle, they were much more sophisticated. So the ones that were seen over America could do things that the ones that people were experimenting with or people had on their minds couldn't do. And then, of course, you move forward a little bit into about the 1910s and the 1920s and 1930s, and people were seeing aircraft, or what they were explaining as aircraft, which were flying in snowstorms, flying in thick fog, all this kind of thing, that nobody would fly in those conditions back then because it was just really, really dangerous. So, but there was things that looked like aircraft, but probably weren't, because they simply didn't, they didn't operate in places where anybody would. They flew over mountain ranges. They flew in, say, really adverse weather conditions, and they performed maneuvers that aircraft couldn't really carry out. Or they were just in places where aircraft just weren't flying around. So it was all a bit weird. And then, of course, you move into the Second World War and you hear the Foo-Fighter encounters. They're doing things that just can't be explained by the technology of the time. But then again, it's supposed to, as you move into much more kind of recognized UFO encounters, such as Kenneth Arnold's 1947 experience and ones after that, again, you're still looking at things that are showing characteristics that can't be explained by technology of the time again, because the objects that Arnold saw he estimated they were flying at something like 1,200, 1,300 miles an hour, and yet the fastest jet aircraft at that time could only do about 650. So you're looking at twice the speed, and if you just look at that alone, that then rules out technology of the time, because there was nothing that they had in the books that could do those sort of speeds in those numbers, and there was 9 objects.
9, with Kenneth Arnold.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a wild story. To move on to your next book, or before we do move on to your next book, is there anything else about the Foo-Fighters and those dates, the kind of 40 to 45, that you think is worth?
Well, I think just as a general comment, the Foo-Fighters originally, before I wrote this book, a lot of people just sort of assumed that it was this narrow focus between about November 1944, when they're traditionally thought to have started, to the end of the war. So you're looking at about 6 months, and over a very, very small patch of Germany, Belgium, and France, where a lot of these sightings took place. But people forget that, or don't realize even in the first place, that actually the Foo-Fighters in Europe were much more geographically widespread. People had seen them over the Bay of Biscay off France. Other sightings took place over the Eastern Front in Russia. There were sightings over the Mediterranean, over North Africa, over Italy, and even reported as far as the North Cape in Norway. So you're looking at practically all of Europe. But as the dates in the book show, 1940 and 1945, it was also the timeline as well. People were seeing them like through the German invasion of France, the German invasion of Belgium, that were being reported then as well, right through to the last days of the war. So, you're looking at the entire war and the entire geographical spread of Europe. So it's not just this concentrated phenomenon. They're happening everywhere and right through the war.
Wow. Yeah, that is fascinating. I can't wait to read it, to be honest. And for anybody that wants to, the link will be in the description. So just scroll down and get it there. Was it your next book, right? Dawn of the Flying Saucers, Aerial UFO Encounters and Official Investigations, 1946 to 1949. Was that always part of the plan to write a series of books, or was it kind of as you were in the process of the first one, you're like, I don't want to stop? Or how was the process?
Well, funny enough, the Dawn of the Flying Saucers wasn't the next one that came along. So this one was the next one that came along. Flying Saucer Fever, yeah. So this is the one I wrote. Yeah. This is the one I wrote next. Chronologically, you're right. Dawn of the Flying Saucers comes next, but I'd actually wrote Flying Saucer Fever first. So which one would you like me to talk about?
Up to you entirely. Okay. Whichever you feel is right.
Fair enough then. So I wrote Flying Saucer Fever because I was intrigued about the aerial encounters during 50 and 52, and there was a lot going on. So you'd had the initial US Air Force investigations, Project Sign and Project Grudge, were pretty much out of the way by then. Grudge was still going on, but it was quite moribund. And then, so this is before Blue Book, and there were things happening in 50 and 51 that were just defying explanation still. And then as 52 kicked in, March 1952, Blue Book was created to look at them again. But then you had in July 52, you had the two Washington weekends where the lights and other things were seen around the Capitol in America and defied explanation. They were seen on radar, pilots were seeing them, but every time the US Air Force were putting up jets, these things just disappeared, and then they came back as soon as the jets went away back to base to refuel. So lots of really nice stories. Of course, there was a lot of people know about these stories who have any experience with UFOs in terms of reading about them, but there was a lot of stuff that appeared in the book that never really had been put elsewhere, and it was just a case of going through the Blue Book archives, through the reports, because they were available. You could look through them, but a lot of the stories had never really been told before, and it was a case of sitting down, looking at the witness reports, looking through the intelligence documents, and some of the analysis, and then just going, right, that's a really interesting story. I'll tell that, and this, that, and the other. So it built up a picture of those 3 years. And then once I'd written that, and just as an aside, I managed to get Lou Elizondo to write the foreword for it as well, which I was quite happy about.
Yeah, and there's Sean Cahill and George Knapp on the other two.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. So after I'd written that one, this is when I got the idea of writing a series, because I realized it was out of sync with a Foo-Fighters book. There was obviously a bit of a patch of time
missing time. Excuse the pun.
Between end of 1945 and the beginning of 1950, which I hadn't really told the story of. So I thought, right, I'm going to fill that gap. And that's where Dawn of the Flying Saucers came in. So it starts with some sightings over the kind of Sweden and some ones in America, which happened even before Kenneth Arnold sighting, which again, most people sort of think of as the dawn, as the start of the modern day UFO phenomenon. But there were
ghost rockets.
Yeah, that's right. But there were also
over Sweden.
But there were things happening in America. There was a couple of sightings in America as well in 46. So it was important to tell the stories of these sightings that happened before what people regard as the start of the modern day phenomenon, just so you get it historically accurate, and it's not people sort of thinking that something's true when actually no, you have to push the dates a bit further back. So, but yeah, then it talks about Kenneth Arnold. There's a chapter on Kenneth Arnold because a lot of people seem to think, or under the false impression, that those objects were crescent shaped, and that they're some kind of German flying wing design from World War II. Which that story's done the rounds for years now, but actually it's incorrect, because when you look at the original documentation from the reports from the time, when Kenneth Arnold, he actually wrote a 9-page letter to establish his bona fides basically for the investigators, and at the end he drew a picture of what he'd seen, and it was heel shaped. And that's the shape of the craft that he saw over the mountains.
Heel shaped.
Heel shaped, yeah. So you can imagine the heel of a shoe. You've got the curve, and you've got that kind of indent in the middle bit. That's what they were shaped like. So rather than being crescent shaped as you see in popular kind of pictures, and actually he changed his story later in later years. He endorsed an artist's impression which looked like a crescent, which had a vague resemblance to a German wartime fighter design.
So he had to go and like confuse everything just at the last minute.
Well, yeah, it's obfuscation, isn't it? So it as you say, confuses people, and people have ran with that link between the this later picture that he endorses and the Horton flying wing, or one of the Horton flying wing designs from World War II, and people are, well, therefore it's a German secret weapon that either the Russians built or the Americans built. Well, it actually no, because if you dig in much further, you can find out why that's not true. But unfortunately, some people don't really, do more than scratch the surface when they're looking at UFOs, and that's where a lot of the trouble starts. But anyway, so there's a chapter on that. But then there's other chapters on less, much more obscure, less well-known stories throughout the 46 to 49 period, as there is with the 50-52 book that I wrote. So again, it's just important to see these stories come out. They may not amount to anything in terms of vastly pushing our understanding or our experience forward, but from a historian's point of view, it's great to be able to tell stories that match, I guess, a narrative, because it's telling a story about, look, these things happened back then. But also interwoven with the stories of the encounters, I've also tried to tell the story of how the US Air Force tried and failed to explain what they were seeing, because that ran through from 46 to 40, from 47 right through to 52 and onwards. At the end of 47, the US Air Force were coming up with something called Project Sign, which kicked in the start in 1948. But then for whatever reason, which I go into in the book, they ended it at the end of 1948 and came up with Project Grudge, which had a focus on trying to explain them away as much more mundane things, such as probably Soviet aircraft, because the sort of not quite gone down the UFO rabbit hole in 48. They got as far, the people behind Project Sign had written up what they called an estimate of the situation. It's like an intelligence analysis, saying that we can't rule out effectively extraterrestrials. They didn't say that in so many words, but that was that's where they were going. And of course, it got pushed upstairs to the higher echelons of US Air Force command, and they battened it back down, saying, look, we can't have a report that says these things without proof. And I think from then, the die was cast in terms of focusing the attention of explaining these UFO reports as much more mundane things, such as potential Soviet reconnaissance aircraft or other types of platform that might have been mistaken for UFOs. And then, of course, when Blue Book kicked in 1952, initially you can see the reports come up a lot of the times with, we just don't know what this is, but then you can see it says balloon or other aircraft or reflections from cockpit, all this kind of stuff. And it just got worse and worse and worse as the years went on, to the point when Hynek came up with his infamous swamp gas explanation, and I think it might have been 66 or something like that. And then, of course, he did a bit of a volte-face about his opinion on UFOs when he left the project ended in 69. But fun time. So really, I've set myself this kind of task of writing up like collections of years at a time. Funny enough, I've just finished the 1953 to 1954 segment, and that's awaiting to get a forward written, and that'll be published as well at some stage in the future. And I've just started writing a 55 to 57 collection as well, so it'll keep me busy for years, this.
Definitely. Yeah, there's loads. I love it how you're doing it in like 2 or 3 year segments rather than you could go for a decade, but obviously there's so much there, but you're doing it in much more detail then.
I think that there was obviously a kind of I could have looked at, well, I'll just write the entire story of UFO encounters with aircraft and pilots. But either you would have a huge volume of like 2,000 pages, or you'd have to cut a lot of stuff out, and you would just end up with the stories that everybody knows. Well, that's been done before. So rather than have a sort of 600 or 700 page book which dwells on very, very loosely the stories that people know and love, with the same information, the same characters, the same analysis, I figured that if I spend time just writing a book of a a few hundred pages on a few select years at a time. I can go at length with the reports. I can put the actual intelligence reports and the words verbatim in the words of the people who were drafting the documents in the first place. So I'm not missing things out. I'm not putting things out of context. Because I think it's quite important that people read them as they were written at the time and don't see a kind of modern day spin on things, because you see a lot of that in not just in UFO books, but also in other types of history, where people are putting a much more modern focus on things and trying to tell a story in a modern fashion. Yeah. And it doesn't always work, because sensibilities from nowadays don't necessarily apply to back then. So I think it was important to tell a story through the words of the people who were writing the reports at the time, but also the people who were seeing at the time. So you look at newspaper reports and other things like that. And it just builds up nice little stories about each particular encounter. And some of them, quite frankly, I wasn't aware of either. And I know a lot of other people aren't, because I've been told so. And that's lovely to be able to, put stories out there that people are definitely not aware of. And hopefully they get something out of that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's so important that these historical cases do come to the fore, and it's so good that you're doing that work. Because, I mean, like you said, obviously it's not kind of happening, it's not something that's right now happening, this sighting from last year, but it still happened, and there's still record of it, and it's so important that, because it's very relevant to what's going on now, obviously. To go back to those two books then, so the Flying Saucer Fever, the chronologically the first 50 to 52, that's when the White House kind of flyover.
Yes,
is that when that was? So that was the closest thing to what everybody says. Oh, I'll believe it when they land on the White House lawn. That was the closest they've come, right?
Yeah, because they were flying in Washington airspace, and they did it one weekend, and then they came back and did it the next weekend as well.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. What would you say from that book is either the most compelling or the most kind of unknown and interesting, or just what's one case that maybe you'd be comfortable kind of mentioning now and just kind of giving a brief outline?
So this is the cover of the book, and it shows basically two unknown objects next to a huge B-36 Peacemaker bomber. Now this aircraft had 10 engines. It had 6 piston-driven engines with backward-facing propellers and 4 jet engines. Except the variant I'm actually in the book, in terms of the case, didn't have the jet engines, because it was an earlier version that they fitted these engines later on, because they realized this bomb was just totally underpowered. But it was vast. It had a 15-man crew, and there was one over an airbase down the south of America, and this is the beginning of, I believe it's something like May 1950 or something like that. And you'll see on the cover, because my colleagues Zan Zetterstrom and Olaf Rockner actually managed to do the artwork for this to portray the scene.
Great artwork.
They're really good.
Great covers.
They've done the artwork for all 3 of these books. And you'll see one of these objects tucked between the tailplane and the wing of the bomber. And that's where it was reported. So and this is the person who actually wrote the intelligence report on the case. When he debriefed the crew, he was actually one of the witnesses on the ground as well. And he was looking up at this aircraft, and he saw these 2 objects. One was nearby, and this other one was tucked in between the tailplane and the wing. And that's amazing to think that this thing had just sat there where the aircraft was flying along in the sky. Now, the intelligence document is available for this case. However, the pilots and the crew side of it, all their reports aren't there anymore. They've just disappeared. The only information you have from the case is this intelligence officer called Major Petlusta, and he was on the ground with another guy, and they were looking up and seeing this. And their information's there, their report, their witness statements are there, but the rest of it isn't. So it's a fascinating case in terms of the proximity of the object to effectively a nuclear-capable bomber, because the B-36 was designed to drop atom bombs, on Russian targets, flying from America and back. It was like an early version, well, not quite the same as, but like an early concept of a B-52, if you like. It was a transcontinental bomber. So having something so sensitive an aircraft, bearing in mind its role, and then effectively over an airbase as well, and this object sitting where it was and not otherwise interacting with the aircraft, but presumably they'd be quite scared of seeing this thing just sitting there. And then, of course, with the actual reports from the the pilot and the air and the other 14 members of the crew not being available anymore. It builds up into a fascinating case, and certainly one I'd never come across before, and I can't remember seeing it ever anywhere else either.
No, I don't think I've ever come across that before either. And I like you, have read quite a few, and dug quite deep. But no, I've never come across that. Did the officer that left the report, did he say how long this thing was there for? How long it was tucked between the tail?
Yeah, it was. I believe it was several minutes. It was enough for them to be able to get a good read on it as they were watching the aircraft flying over. But bearing in mind, the aircraft would have disappeared from view after a period of time. It can't have lasted more than maybe 30 seconds to a couple of minutes from where they were standing. But it would be intriguing to read the witness statements from the aircrew. So hopefully one day those will surface. So yeah, that was one of the more intriguing ones. But there are plenty of others in the book. Don't worry.
Yeah, yeah, I bet. And can I ask you the same thing for the next book? It's the one before, I suppose, the kind of 46 to 49, Dawn of the Flying Saucers. So obviously everybody knows the headliner, which I'm supposing you did reference in there, Roswell.
Well, funny enough, Roswell, I can't, because that's not an aerial encounter as such, and it was a crash. I can't reconcile it with a book because also it doesn't fit in.
It's probably a good thing anyway.
Well, yeah, but it also, the crash itself, and if the Americans got technology, as it were, it doesn't fit into why they're still looking at all these reports afterwards, because surely they would know what they were. So, and I go to length in the forward, in the introduction, and also the conclusion of the book, in saying, look, it's all very well having this story about Roswell, but how do you fit it into the rest of the UFO story, in terms of what people were seeing and the analysis that were being doing, and also the US Air Force investigation programs? Something doesn't sort of sit right with everything. I'm not saying Roswell didn't happen. It's very difficult to actually fit it into a story about how you investigate UFOs at large.
It's so convoluted and everything now, and there's so much time has passed, and there were clearly secrets kept, right? No matter which side you stand on, that's just a fact. So yeah, it's a hard one to. I don't think we're ever going to fully iron out every single crease in that, are we? We'll never have the 100% clear.
But in terms of telling a story from the book, okay. So we're looking at 1st of October 1948, and this is over Fargo, which is North Dakota in America, and we're going to fight 4 F-51 Mustangs, so they're propeller-driven aircraft from World War II, but they're still being used after the war by Air National Guard pilots. And it's an Air National Guard unit, 4 aircraft flying back on a night flight as an exercise, coming back to the airfield at Fargo, and 3 of them land, and 1 of them stays up in the air because his pilot has some fuel left and he wants to do a bit more light flying practice. And then he suddenly sees a light below him. He's seen a Piper Cub aircraft flying into the airport, and it's not that. This light's separate. It's actually above the lights of the city, and it's flying around. So he tells the tower he's going to investigate. He gets into a dogfight with the light. The light is basically flying around him. He's trying to get on its tail, and all of a sudden it makes a head-on pass at him. And he thinks it's going to hit his aircraft, so he dives out of the way, and it flies on. The next time, it tries to do another pass at him, and another head-on pass, and he stays his ground. He doesn't move out of the way, and it just climbs out of the way, and it shoots up into the air. He tried to follow it, but at 14,000 feet, his aircraft wasn't powerful enough to keep flying up them vertically. And it got into what they call an engine stall. The engine can't provide enough power, and the aircraft falls away. He manages to gain control, and the aircraft does another pass at him. The light does another pass at him. And that's when he finally gives up the pursuit, and the light flies away, and he lands. Meanwhile, the people in the tower at the airfield, at Fargo, have seen him and the light, sort of in this kind of engagement, if you like.
The dance.
Yeah, that's right. Effectively a dance in the skies. The pilot of the Piper Cub, he was a doctor. He'd actually went up to the tower as well to see what was happening, and he saw the light flying around. So it was really, really, really weird. Debunkers from back then were trying to say you just saw a planet or something, or a star, but actually the pilot had seen it superimposed over the lights of the city, so it couldn't have been something celestial. There was also a story that it was supposed to be a weather balloon, but the weather balloons that were released from the airfield were painted black. They weren't white like standard weather balloons. They were actually painted black, and they had an instrument package underneath. Now, they wouldn't have been seen, and the lights were effectively candles inside a box. You wouldn't have seen that, and it wouldn't have been flying around at the kind of speeds that were encountered, and head-on maneuvers with an aircraft, and then shooting up into the atmosphere, kind of thing. So, yeah, the debunking stories don't add up, but the story itself is intriguing, but makes no sense whatsoever. It's just one of those incredible stories which you read and then you just start scratching your head. But there's a lot of documentation because the witness, the pilot, who was called George Gorman, he was interviewed at length. He has a story. His commanding officer vouched for him in terms of being a fairly straight up guy, kind of thing. He wasn't prone to making stories. And also Project Sign, as was at the time, they investigated it. So they sent people there to talk to him. They looked at the aircraft to make sure there's nothing wrong with it and all the rest of it. So yeah, it builds up to a fascinating story that it constitutes a chapter in the book because it was worth a chapter on its own about that particular case.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. That sounds fascinating. Like you said, it's enough to be able to scratch your head and sit there in disbelief, trying to comprehend what on earth took place, but it's not enough to be able to debunk it as some people have tried. Yeah, wow. So you said the next book is going to be, what, 51 to 53?
No, 53 to 54. So it's just
53 to
2 years. Yeah. So again, it's a collection of American military pilots, not just in America, but elsewhere, and some civilian pilots, so airline pilots, but also private pilots as well. And there's the story about a BOAC crew, that's a British Overseas Aircraft Corporation crew, coming over Labrador, that's just off the kind of Newfoundland area of North America, and they're over the sea, and they see an object that changes shape 3 times as well. And it's got also smaller craft or objects next to it, and that was a famous case from the time. And it's done the rounds in the books to a certain extent, but I managed to find out various newspaper articles which are at the time that cover the story, but also the official investigation and notes as well. So that's all appears in the book as well. So it tells the story in hopefully a little bit more detail than sometimes you see elsewhere.
Wow. Yeah, you're doing all the hard work for us, Graeme. I remember a few years ago, I got to a point where I'd read so many, and dug so deep, I was like confident enough to say to myself, okay, there's going to be thousands more of these, hundreds at least, probably thousands, maybe more reports, very similar, some of them different, but all kind of following a vague, pattern of being hard to explain. And you're doing the work of actually finding them and putting them in front of us. So I really appreciate that. And obviously it's nice to be proved right. I mean, only myself. I'm proving myself correct to myself, but it still feels good. How far are you going to go with it? Are you going to go all the way up to the modern day, like UFO encounters 04, 05, the Nimitz?
Who knows? If I'm still alive by that time, if I get that point, I guess there'll come a point where it'll be actually possible to contact people who are still alive, and who have a decent memory of the events concerned. So I guess as I approach the sort of late 50s, early 1960s, I'll be able to start putting out feelers to contact people who were, the witnesses themselves, and see what their recollections are, sort of nowadays, as opposed to, and maybe compare that with the documentation from the time. So that'll be quite nice when I get to that point. I'm not quite there yet. Yes, there probably are 1 or 2 people who are still alive, but it's very difficult to contact the people, the ones and twos of those, the very, very small amount of people who are connected with these cases. But yes, I'll be starting to do that shortly, because it'll be just an extra dimension for the books. So you'll get the information, the historical side, but hopefully you'll get some kind of counter with the up-to-date, on the spot information just from the people concerned, and get their point of view as well, and see whether, and maybe some people's recollections have changed, maybe their opinion has changed for good or bad, but that'll be still interesting as well, because a lot of the times in some of these cases, I'm not afraid of putting them forward when they were not debunked but actually explained properly, and somebody did say, yeah, that's what it was, and actually when you look at it you go, actually that's right. It's rather just than everybody saying, everything that Sign, Grudge, and Blue Book did was wrong. Well, actually, no, that's not true. Occasionally they did explain things correctly, because things were reported mistakenly, but they're few and far between. And in some of the cases where they say, oh yeah, they were a weather balloon or they were this, that, and the other, you can show from the actual evidence they amassed themselves that's not right. It's just that was the thing they put out there to see whether anybody would go, yeah, okay, the Air Force is saying it's this, there, we'll just accept it. You mentioned the Washington weekends, in July 52 before, and there was this huge kind of this huge thing that happened over the 2 weeks, and the US Air Force were presumably getting quite worried because they couldn't do anything about this. They're sending jets up. As soon as the jets got to Washington, the lights disappeared, and then the jets had to come back to refuel. And as soon as that happened, they appeared. And the US Air Force took the unprecedented step of actually holding a press conference after the second weekend on the following Monday, and they put a major general up, a director of intelligence up, so quite a high-ranking intelligence officer, to try and sort of steady the ship, if you like, to calm the nerves of people. And or the press were asking all the questions, and they came up with a whole load of theories and explanations, which actually didn't make really much sense. But it was enough for the press to go away and go, okay, the Air Force have said it's nothing to worry about. So their focus went elsewhere, and they weren't as keen to put these stories in the paper anymore, or at least to build up the hype that was amassing of, we don't know what's happening. So yeah, it was never really the same again, I think, after that. But yeah, the press were gullible in some respects about accepting the party line. Unfortunately, the sightings kept going. They didn't stop.
And obviously with Blue Book, they went further down the road of stigmatize and yes. dismiss and ignore.
They did. You can see the early kind of incarnations of that even before Blue Book started. So you can read the reports and you'll see the analysis of the intelligence officers, even before these reports were passed signed to Grudge and to Blue Book. You'll see the spin that the intelligence officers, all the explanations they suggest. And reading between the lines, you can say, they're thinking the pilot's an idiot because it's a balloon or it's a reflection from their cockpit. Pilot must have been mistaken, or this kind of stuff. You'll see these kind of this kind of wording. So therefore, there'd be a stigma. And if enough of that information got back to the crews, well, naturally they're going to think twice about reporting it next time around. And Ruppelt, Ed Ruppelt, who was the director of Blue Book, he wrote in his autobiography that he'd got together with, or he had a chance encounter with a group of airliner pilots in Chicago on a layover one day, and they'd said to him, that they were sort of, wary about reporting sightings because of the building stigma. And of course, being an airliner, a pilot for a company, the last thing you want is to be considered unreliable, because your company might turn around and maybe fire you for coming up with what they might have thought were wild stories. But the stigma started early.
Yeah, it's a pretty insane situation, isn't it? Really, when you step back and look at it, and you're like, wow, this whole everything that lives on this planet, or this one species, these humans, the dominant species on this planet, they've all decided to make it impossible to discuss this thing that's clearly taking place in one form or another, whatever it may be. It's just crazy, really. Yeah, to think about how we've made it impossible for pilots, well, not anymore, it's changing now, but we did make it almost impossible for pilots to come forward and keep the same standing in their career, keep their reputation, keep their pension or whatever it might be they're worried about. And the same for people within government and even just civilians, members of the public that have got like nothing to lose. It would just be laughed about, I suppose, wouldn't it?
I mean, even taking away the dimension of the kind of conspiracy theory element in terms of, oh, well, they're just trying to like hide the truth, so therefore you rubbish the witness. If you take that away and just set it along its kind of the scenario of somebody comes to you and says, I saw something really, really strange in the sky, and they did this and they did that and they did the other, then if you're some kind of professional Air Force career officer and one of your airmen comes to you and starts saying that, the first thing you might think about is he still safe to fly? So you can understand from that point of view, if they're coming up with these kind of explanations and that's set against all these other stories which are coming out, then naturally commanders might have on the spot just thought these people might not be reliable, and therefore we have to look at them. And some pilots were asked to take medicals. So they were actually had to actually prove their fitness to fly. And then of course the others might think, well, I'm not going to go through that again because I don't want to have to go, might be like judged, ill fit to fly, and therefore I can't continue my career. But if there was an angle where they're trying to hide something, then the natural thing would have been to discredit the witness, whether they were civilian or military or both. And it would be the easiest thing in the world to sow doubt. There's always enough people who are quite willing to accept a rational explanation for something, even if it actually, when you look into it quite carefully, doesn't stack up properly. But if you throw enough stuff at the wall and some of it sticks. So if you can say often enough, it's a weather balloon, and once or twice it actually is a weather balloon, really, then that's all you need to be able to, that's all the ingredients you need to say, well, this so-called phenomenon is nothing to write home about. So
yeah, especially if a lot of people want to believe that the prosaic explanation, because I know it's quite a popular line of the debunker of like, oh yeah, you want to believe it's aliens, you want to believe it's I mean, I don't think that's a particularly, I mean, obviously there's an exciting side to that, but there's also a terrifying side to that. If there is something here that's non-human, that's intelligent and is able to fly around us like we're nothing, that's pretty scary. Even if they've got good intentions, which they may well have, we don't know that. So yeah, I don't think there's many people that would want to hold up. I mean, there obviously are both sides. There are people that would want to believe it's aliens, but I think a lot of people would want to be, oh yes, okay, so it was a balloon, great, okay, good, I can just carry on with my day now and not worry about anything I think the
default setting for cases should be that people should be prepared to not necessarily debunk them, but to also just to investigate them. So whether that ends up with a prosaic explanation or
old-fashioned skepticism.
Exactly. You shouldn't just be spoon-fed everything and believe everything you hear or read or see. It's not, you should have some kind of healthy skepticism and have your default section as sort of level as it must be something, or it may well be something prosaic. And then you look into it and then you just cross everything off one by one, rather than have a default setting as it's something mundane or it's something unbelievable. Whichever side of the fence you sit on, that shouldn't be where you start from. Because you shouldn't be trying to prove it's that or prove it's the other. You should be looking at it and trying to rule things out, just to the point then when what you're left with, it's the whole Sherlock Holmes thing, isn't it? That you rule out all the known stuff and you come out with the unknown, and that's what you end up with. So that's the way people should do it. And there are noted debunkers, not just the current ones that people hear about on Twitter, etc., but there've been ones in the past, and I refer to some of them in the books because they're that old. And back then they were coming out with, if they would throw something out there, and if it didn't stick, they would come up with something else. And if that didn't stick, they would have a third one lined up. In fact, there was one particular debunker called Donald Menzel. He had 7 explanations for one particular kind of set of things that happened, and it was just one after another. So, and then of course they were knocked down. And if that's going to happen, then you have to think, clearly he's committed to try and find a mundane explanation, but surely you should have one strong one. You shouldn't just have one and they go, oh, that doesn't work. Oh, well, it must be something else. Oh, it must be something else. Because why are you falling back on something which is probably more ridiculous than the first one you came up with? It doesn't, it just sort of defies it makes your credibility suspect in terms of a so-called expert who is coming up with these debunking theories. If you're having to then fall back onto another one when your first one doesn't stack up either, to start with, your next one's not going to be as strong, and the 7th one certainly is going to be nowhere near as strong as the first one. So, but then of course you can flip that onto the other side of the argument as well. So the people, I guess, the true believers who every time they see a video of a light in the sky, those are aliens. And I don't like that either, because a lot of the time that light in the sky could be something prosaic. We just haven't got enough information to be able to say that's the case. Equally, it could be something completely, out of our sort of knowledge and our experience. But you can't necessarily leap to that without much more information. A light in the sky can be just a light in the sky until you have, more information to explain it. And sometimes people shouldn't jump to conclusions.
No, I agree completely. Because skepticism, obviously, at its foundation, is it's questioning things, right? It's questioning everything. And it's kind of recently, the last few years, it's kind of come to mean a different thing in pop culture. I think in a lot of ways it's come to mean, I think, like the hardcore debunking. You know, a skeptic these days could easily be mixed up with somebody that just sets out from the start, like you said,
to rubbish things,
regardless of what they're trying to explain it as something prosaic or as this or as that. And I think, that's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, we wouldn't listen to somebody who was called themselves, I don't know what they'd call themselves, but somebody who was determined to explain every UFO sighting as aliens. We wouldn't listen to them for long. We'd pretty quickly learn to switch off and just be like, this is totally biased. But it's the same thing. If somebody goes too hard on the debunking, if your entire objective is to rubbish it, like you say, then that's not good. That's not good technique. That's not good.
I don't mind people having a kind of skepticism about things, but then keeping an open mind and saying, look, I can't rule anything out. But equally on the other side of the fence, I don't mind people necessarily jumping to conclusions as long as they have the kind of wherewithal to think, well, okay, I might be thinking it's that, but that's my opinion. I can't back it up, and I could be wrong. I can't back it up with evidence. You know, I'm not quite sitting on the fence about a lot of things, but a lot of the time when I see things, I still have the kind of, the capacity to think, well, look, I don't have enough, evidence or information here to say one way or another what that is. I'd like to think it might be something, but I can't prove that. Equally, I can't, I've looked at it and I know it's not that. And I know it's not something much more mundane. And it's definitely not what somebody else has said, that's all it is. But at the same time, if more information came forward and it turned out to be something fairly prosaic, I'll hold my hands up and go, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that's what it is. But equally, someone might come along with more information that actually proves it's something much more out of the ordinary. And I think until then, some people might just maybe want to hedge their bets a bit more and not be so kind of vociferous in where they come down on either side of the argument. So because I don't think it does people many favors in the end.
No, I would agree.
And then you get some really wild card things. Sorry, you get some really wild card things. There was a Uri Geller story that appeared in one of the newspapers. It might have been the Star, actually, as he mentioned before, a few days ago. And he was talking about something that fell into the water off Scotland, and there was a Polish-built destroyer with beam weapons on a cannon and beam weapons on board. Went to intercept, and you just think, no. No, for so many reasons. The Polish don't operate destroyers, they don't build them nowadays, so they don't have anything that has so-called beam weapons on board.
Yeah, and there's enough out there, isn't there, to not have to worry about beam weapons.
Well, exactly.
For now, at least. We kind of stopped talking about your books, but I didn't get a final. I just wanted to check the one that I think you've just finished it. Have you, the latest one?
53 to 54, I've just finished. It's waiting on somebody writing a forward for it.
Okay, so have you got a name and a release date, or not quite yet?
I've got a name for the book, but I'm not giving it out yet.
Do you want to give the third word?
The second word is "and."
Oh, nice. That's some hot stuff there.
As of for release, it may well be out either just before or just after Christmas.
Okay,
so
cool.
It's maybe imminent, but not like directly imminent, if you know what I mean. I don't want to have people thinking I'm just pushing these out every 5 minutes. They're coming out as and when I finish them, but I'm also conscious of the fact that I don't want people just to think it's some kind of like production line. I'm taking some care over them.
It's just secretly you've been working on it for 30 years. You've already written all the way up to 1995 already. You're just waiting to publish them sneakily.
Well, funny enough, here's a secret. I'd actually written Dawn of the Flying Saucers and the 53 to 54 book at the same time. I basically wrote them.
Really?
I basically wrote them one after another.
Wow.
And I'd finished the 53-54 book pretty much at the same time as Dawn of the Flying Saucers was released, because it took a little time to get obviously for George Knapp to write the forward and get it back and check it and do some proofreading, etc., and get the book out and the artwork, etc.
Yeah.
So the other one was done already by then, so it's not like as you say, I've got a whole kind of stack of them. That is the only one that hasn't been released yet.
Yeah, because from the outsider, it feels like there's either the stack or you're just one of the fastest authors and writers in the world. Wow. You sit down, you're like, okay, here we go. these are the years I'm working on. 2 weeks later,
I'm
you finish the book.
self-employed. You say I'm a self-employed author, so I can literally sit and write all day if I want to. I don't have a day job that I've got to fit around it. I mean, I've got a wife, I've got a family, but I don't. It's not kind of existence where I've got to spend a lot of time doing something else. And my wife's quite, sort of quite happy for me just to bury myself away and just write, for hours on end. Keeps me out of her hair basically, so it's quite a good arrangement. But I can literally get up at 7 in the morning and start writing, and I'll go down for breakfast at 9. So there's 2 hours out of the way that I've written,
Yeah.
and then I'll come back to it maybe 11 o'clock in the morning or something after I've done a couple of chores, and then sit and write till 3. Or whenever I get fed up or sick, or the inspiration goes, or I run out of information, and then I might be back up after tea, and I might be writing until 9, 10, whenever I get tired. So, and I was writing this morning, even though it's a bank holiday in England because of the Queen's funeral. I was writing this morning. I write sometimes weekends. I'll 5 minutes here, maybe an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours there. My wife tells people that I've retired, and I go, I've not retired. I write every day.
Passion project, I guess.
But I'm constantly working. I might not be doing it every 24 hours or 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, but I'm working pretty much every day for a certain period of time, and of course it builds up. So if you've got a 7-month book project and you're doing 5 hours on average a day, it turns out to a lot of hours.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm not knocking it. Like I said, I appreciate the work you're putting in for all of us to just be able to read these cases. Let's kind of jump forward like 30 years to a book that's going to come out in 10, 15 years. The 79 to 81. You're obviously familiar with Rendlesham Forest, the Rendlesham Forest incident. And I'd just appreciate it if you could just maybe tell any of our listeners or viewers about that if they're not familiar, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so it's just after Christmas, 1980, and the reports of it's basically strange lights outside the base at Bentwaters and Woodbridge. They're the two bases in East Anglia, and they're quite close to each other. And they were actually, but not known at the time, but it was a repository for American nuclear weapons. So quite a sensitive area. Anyway, the US Air Force send out a patrol of security into the forest at Rendlesham, which is just on the outskirts of one of the bases, and they come across. Well, first of all, they see lights, but then they think it may well be the lighthouse because there's a lighthouse at Orford Ness, which in certain respects can be seen in certain direction, depending on where you're standing. But this wasn't the case because the lights were coming that they were looking for were in a different direction from the lighthouse. And under various conditions, the lighthouse can't be seen in any case. And that was the case on this night. And depending on which account you read, so if you read the Lieutenant Colonel, Charles Holt, who led one of the groups out on one of the nights, because it wasn't just one night, it was a couple of nights. They came across the lights, but also if you talk to other personnel who are out there, they came into direct contact with a triangular-shaped object in the woods that was hovering above the ground, and one of them claims to have touched it and being given what he claims to be like a download of information, which he apparently wrote in a notebook, which was a series of, what looks like binary information that's supposed to have amassed to some kind of discovery.
Like zeros and ones
exactly,
and stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't know how much of it to believe. That came along later, that story, but the core of the story is kind of lights and possibly a craft in the woods. But there have been various explanations over the years to try and explain it away. So the lighthouse is a big kind of theory by a lot of potential debunkers. Equally, it's been put forward that the SAS, the Special Air Service, the British Special Air Service, were conducting an operation to try and penetrate the defences of the airbase, which was a thing that did happen occasionally. So there might have been kind of flashbangs and other pyrotechnics involved, which may have fooled the security guys to thinking there was something strange happening. But it made the newspapers. and it famously made the News of the World newspaper back then. And it was, some of the headline I'm paraphrasing was U.S. Air Force spot UFO in Southwark, and that's official. It had that. So it was a big thing at the time when it came out, and there were various UFO investigators trying to investigate it at the time, and they got so far with information. There was questions in the House of Commons, etc. But there's nothing at this point in time. Nobody's any real further forward in terms of explaining what it was.
Do you have any gut feeling, or like your
No.
kind of number one explanation?
I don't. I'm afraid, Ben. There's enough information there to suggest there was something odd going on, but as to what it was. Then and that's going to sound really, really rubbish from me, but sorry, I can't. I certainly don't have enough information to tell you what it was. It also comes down to what you believe with the certain witnesses, and unfortunately, like Roswell, like you mentioned before, there are over the years other witnesses have come forward who may or may not have been actually connected with it. It could be a case of people trying to insert themselves into a story, and you get more information from other people, which then just confuses the whole thing. So it's turned into one of those stories that there's probably some kind of core truth in it, in terms of the witness statements and the various actions and the incidents and the events, but as to what that was, it's a bit blurred now. So therefore, trying to look at it all as a whole and trying to come up with, well, what's my kind of gut feeling, my explanation, it's harder, and it's to the point of where there's just too much information and not enough reliable information. At least one of the witnesses is slightly suspect, so therefore you have to think how much else of it is a bit kind of off, and you get the point where you just start scratching your head and thinking, I don't know, I really don't know.
Yeah. And the witness that you said is slightly suspect, is that the same witness that said that they kind of touched it? No, it's not. Because that's, for me, that's the most kind of, fascinating part of the case, where this person approaches this craft, according to them, and they walk up to it, and they're clearly feeling a little bit, brave at this moment. So they decide to touch this craft, because I'd be out of there. I don't think I'd be hanging around like, oh, what does it feel like? Is it warm? I'm not gonna get electrocuted or melt my hand while I'm trying to find out. So, but yeah, it's fascinating. To move on to a different case that I'd also love to hear your thoughts on. 2 years prior, maybe slightly, well, definitely less well known, I would say, actually, because this is the UK's Roswell, one of the headline cases that people will kind of point towards in the papers and things like that. The one I wanted to ask you about now is with Frederick Valentich.
Over the Bass Strait and between Australia and Tasmania. Yeah, so he's in a light aircraft and he's flying to an airstrip on an island just off the top of Tasmania. And he's not an experienced pilot, as far as I'm aware, Frederick Valentich, but he's planning to join the Air Force, isn't he? And then there's this kind of series of strange radio messages between himself and the tower from the airfield that he thinks he's taken off from. And he's explaining about like a strange lights or a craft above him, and then he finds that he can't tell which way is up anymore, and then the messages just disappear, and no records of the aircraft ever be found, and obviously the pilot disappeared, etc. So it's a mystery anyway. It's almost like a Bermuda Triangle mystery that the aircraft and the pilot disappears, no trace of. There's various kind of sort of stories that come along to try and explain it over the years, in terms of the pilot maybe going somewhere else and coming up with that to explain that he'd gone somewhere different, and basically try to fake his own death, kind of thing. But also the fact that he was I think he was not a wannabe, that's the wrong thing to say, but he was trying to join the Air Force. He was trying to become a pilot with the Air Force, but there was questions as to how good he was as a pilot as well, and also maybe at night or in bad weather, and that might have been a factor as well. So there's various things to do with the story which don't make it a straightforward kind of UFO abduction case as how it's been portrayed in certain parts of the media. It's another one of those where there's just simply not enough information in terms of trying to explain the loss of the aircraft and the pilot. I believe there's actually a witness off Tasmania who reckoned they saw lights or something in the sky that night.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So, there's probably slowly information dripping out to try maybe give a little bit more kind of sort of info around the case, but it's intriguing. Again, it's another one of those classic stories that crop up in book after book and magazine after magazine. But when you read through it, real further forward than you were when you started reading it, I'm afraid. But from what he says, if you take it at face value, then he's come across something that you can't explain, but a possible craft, and then you can draw your own conclusions after that to what happened.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, taking it at face value. I mean, I first came across it in I don't think first, but the main time I came across it when I actually found out a bit more about it was in Leslie Kane's book, UFOs. But I just think, it's such a bizarre case. So it's quite compelling, but it's just it's quite chilling as well. Like like the conversation, the transcript that he's having, if I remember rightly, I could be wrong, but I think he's kind of basically asking for help in the end. He's saying he's afraid, he's insinuating at least that he's afraid. And I think, the thing was following him, then it disappears for a minute, I think.
Then he says it's back again.
And then it's just back, and then he's like, oh, it's coming closer or something like that, help me, blah, blah, blah. And then that's it. It's kind of, it's a really hard one to wrap my head around, whether it's, like you say, an abduction or whether it's something that shot him down, but then why was the plane never recovered? I mean, obviously it's a lot of space. He could have missed it, but it's and it's quite, I think it's not as well known as it maybe could be, that case.
That's true. There's it's been covered in books at length. I mean, it depends on what you read, but it has featured in quite a lot of books, and the transcript of the conversations over the radio between him and the tower have appeared in print, so they are available. There was a good rundown. There's a guy called Micah Hanks. I'm not sure whether you've heard of him. He does a podcast. And he classes himself as an informed skeptic. Now, he did a show about the Valentich disappearance, and that's probably worth listening to because he goes through all of it, and there's talks to his Valentich's girlfriend as well about what she thought about what his state of mind was before the flight, etc., to see whether that had any kind of anything to do with it. So if you can dig out a copy of that particular podcast, you might be interested in listening to that.
Okay, cool. Did he come to any
again? No, it was one of those things where not enough, but he goes through the story in some depth, so you'll probably find that of interest to the depth he goes to, much more than I've gone to here.
Thank you for the heads up. But no, I can't expect too much from you here. We haven't got that much time to go into each one of these in depth, and we'd have to have our notes here and everything. I guess one that I have to ask you about, obviously you were involved, I believe, in some way in this photo surfacing, and you already know where I'm going, of course. It's Calvine. Just kind of say whatever you want to say about it. I want to hear just your thoughts, but obviously I also kind of want to get to your gut feeling. Obviously you don't know what it is, and you're not going to go on the record today and say one way or another, but just give me your thoughts and feelings.
So Dr. David Clark, who's he teaches or lectures on folklore and things like that, and at Sheffield, at Hallam University, I believe it is. But he's also interested in folklore and UFO lore, if you like, as a subject. He doesn't necessarily believe in it, but then again, he doesn't necessarily disbelieve it as well, unless there's categorical proof to suggest that it's something mundane. But he's quite happy to buy into mundane explanations if that turns out to be what they are. But equally, he's got an open mind in terms of getting through all the information to try to arrive at that position. And he, for years, I mean, I'm talking more than 10 years, he's been interested in the Calvine case. For those of you the audience who don't know what that is, in August 1990, two people were on a hillside in the Scottish Highlands near Pitlochry, and they saw what they described as a diamond-shaped craft with what they described as a jet fighter flying around the area. The negatives that from the photographs they took, because they had a camera with them, were passed to the Daily Record, which is a Scottish daily newspaper, and because the editor and the photo editor were on holiday, their deputies handled the photographs, and they contacted the Ministry of Defence for comment. The MOD said, "Can you pass the information to us?" And of course, they just said yes, rather than keep copies themselves. So everything went to the MOD. They presumably developed photographs from the negatives, because the press officer who actually handled the handover, if you like, from the record to the MOD, a guy called Craig Lindsay, he decided to have one of the pictures for himself, and he kept it. It was probably, he reckons, it was the best of the 6 that were taken. The images were analysed by a special unit of photo interpreters, RAF ones, who their day job was looking at Soviet installations, or Eastern European installations, to detect what things were from space and from aerial reconnaissance, etc. So they were quite well versed at identifying aircraft, known aircraft, etc., and other things. And they concluded that the aircraft in the picture was a Harrier, but they couldn't determine what the object was. And those records were buried away in the MOD files until they were released sometime in, I think it was 2007, 2008. And Dr. David Clarke actually got a hold of these files, and he wrote blogs about this, and had been magazine articles, and he'd been on TV about it. But really, the trail went cold, because nobody had seen one of the photographs. All there was in terms of description in the files was a crude, well, it looked like a photocopy, but it was actually a line drawing. It was something that the photo interpreters had come up with. It almost like you got a bit of greaseproof paper, and you traced, or tracing paper, and you traced the image on the photograph of the object and the Harrier, as it was, to try and work out the dimensions of the object. And that's what they used to use. And this thing was called a line drawing. And when these files were eventually released by the MOD, that's all there was in terms of a visual representation of the case, of the pictures. The photographs weren't there, the negatives weren't there. So that, for years, 15 years or so, that's all we've had to go on.
Yeah.
Dr. Clarke actually joined UAP Media, the organization I belong to, earlier this year. But he'd been working behind the scenes for many months to try to contact this press relations officer, who actually finally got to know about, and in the course of talking to him, found out that he actually had a copy of this picture, which was like.
Yeah.
And we're in conjunction with another of my colleagues, a guy called Vinny Adams, who runs the Disclosure Team podcast. The two of them actually travelled up to and met this former press officer, who initially was reluctant, for good reason, to hand the photograph over, but eventually did. So now we have one of the original 6 photographs that the RAF interpreters used to try and work out what this thing was. And of course, they couldn't come to, or didn't come to, a conclusion as to what the object was. But there is a Harrier in the picture, which then leads to the questions of, was the Harrier there by accident? Was it there by design in terms of intercepting an unknown object, or was it there as an escort? And either of those 3 scenarios throws up more questions. So it's one of those things you said before, you get more information, you get more questions. So at the moment, the 3 of us and other people are investigating to try and find out a bit more information about the aircraft that were there, because that's the easiest place to start. But also, we're asking the MOD to say, well, look, the position's changed now. It's not just a 50-year nothing of defence significance has happened. We've got a picture here now, which has been in the RAF's hands. They've looked at it. Yes, okay, there's a Harrier there, but what is this thing? Why is this not of defence significance? Nobody knows what it is. You don't even know what it is. So therefore, if the MOD is saying we don't know what that is, how come that can't be of defence significance?
Yeah, it's an oxymoron, really, isn't it? Like, either you know what it is and it's not of defence significance, or it is, or you don't know and it's of some kind of significance to the defence. There's no question.
Absolutely bonkers already. And I did this last year. I was in the National Archives looking through the Harrier Squadron's information for August 1990 to see whether any of their aircraft had been deployed there, because that would explain that, or at least that part of the part of the story. but there's nothing
Yeah.
at all. I'm due to go down to the
Okay.
archives later this month for some other searches in relation to Calvine. So, I'll let people know how I get on. But I'm not expecting to find anything. I'm not expecting to find a smoking gun, because I don't think that's where it'll appear. You wouldn't expect that kind of information to be just put in the public records for somebody to find maybe 10, 15 years down the line. So, yeah, I'm not expecting much. But at least it's a way to rule things out. And then when you go back to the MOD at some stage, you can say, look, I've looked through the archives. They say nothing. What else can you give us?
The object in the picture that's clearly a plane.
Yes.
Have you so you don't know exactly what kind of
it's a
plane
Harrier.
it is?
It's a Harrier.
It
It's
is
a
a
Harrier.
Harrier. Do you know if it's British or is it American?
The story is that there was two, because in the actual in the MOD documents where they're talking about the analysis of the line drawing, they mention the Harrier, but they also say there's a suggestion of another one as well, which you can't see from that image, but you might be able to from one of the 5 that haven't been found yet. Now, the talk is, and this is from David Clark, who's talked to people off the record, etc., and behind the scenes, and on the record as well. But the talk is that there was one American and one British, so therefore that tends to suggest that there were an escort for whatever this was. But that's not necessarily the case. It could simply be that there was some reason why they needed one of each to intercept something, but that's unlikely.
To coordinate something at very quick notice. So we need one of both. No, one of both.
Bearing in mind, American Harriers were only US Marine Corps, and they were only deployed on certain very small aircraft carriers, what they call assault carriers, not the big US Navy ones. And the locations of those are known. And at the time, as far as I'm aware, there was one in the Atlantic, but it was off West Africa. So that's probably the nearest one there was. And if a US Marine Corps Harrier landed at an airbase in Britain somewhere, the aircraft spotters would know. I used to know plenty of them back in those days. And I was a photographer, and etc. And I was an enthusiast, so I knew these people, and I would have probably got to hear about it. So there's a lot of doubt, but a lot of also information, lack of information that would simply need more on to be able to determine what this was. Again, it's frustrating in many ways, but also it's a mystery that needs solving. So there are plenty of people working behind the scenes. Just because it doesn't appear on Twitter or on Facebook or on the news every 5 minutes, that doesn't mean to say there aren't people working away. We're just waiting on information coming back to us or getting in touch with people. And there's still a general plea for the 2 witnesses to come forward, because they never have done, even though their witness statements are in the MOD files. The information that the reporting officer who they phoned the initial report to, he took down the information, that's still there, but they've never come forward. And the pilot of the aircraft, there's been feelers out to try and trace him, the Harrier, the definite Harrier, never come forward either. Those people could really put information out there that would really help to explain this case. And as for my gut feeling, I think if I had to bet money on it, it would be probably some kind of black American project, black project rather, that still, for whatever reason, hasn't been unveiled to the public yet. But that's just what I sort of have come to believe based on everything that's sort of around, all the information around this case. The fact that there were aircraft that looked like they were escorting it, the possibility that the MOD put a D notice on this case, and that's a voluntary arrangement for the press not to report something, because the story never appeared in the Daily Record. Even though they had the information from the witnesses, they had the negatives that they passed on to the MOD. They actually had the core of a story. They might not have been put an image up, but they certainly had the details, which they could have published. But for whatever reason, they chose not to. And they still have never really mentioned it. They actually, I think it was a year or two ago, they mentioned the fact that the MOD had restricted access to the remaining information in the files until 2076, which is probably just the names and addresses of the witnesses, to be fair. And they quoted the Mirror as being the source of the story. They never said, they never did anything themselves. So they're still, for some reason, not prepared to own this case as in terms of their original involvement with it, which is preposterous, really.
We can guarantee it's not due to lack of interest. So it's for one compelling reason either way. It's either theirs and they know it, or it's not theirs and they know it. I think I know the answer to this question, but is there any kind of aircraft that would have been known about back then, even that could have been black ops that's come out since? No. But was there anything in disguise that could have?
No, because it's supposed to have hovered for something like 10 minutes and then shot upwards in the sky. We don't know how fast it moved, because it's mentioned that it shoots up in the sky, but that's your version of shooting up in the sky. Subjective. Mine's completely different, and who knows what the two witnesses had in terms of on their minds in terms of how fast it was going. But for something to hover and then to fly off, that's you're looking at another step beyond what things do now. And Harriers can hover, but they're very loud when they do that, and they do it in air shows. They don't do that. They don't really do that during the course of normal flights. It's a party trick, effectively. And you'd know about that. Whereas this thing was silent, apparently. So, what kind of propulsion system was it? How was it being controlled? It doesn't have any wings, as far as you can tell. It doesn't have a tail. So where's its aerodynamic control surfaces? How can it turn? How can it ascend? How can it dive? All the rest of it. There's a lot of unknowns with it. And why hasn't it come out? The things like the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber, their lead time from being kind of first built and tested up until the time when they were finally publicly unveiled is about 12 to 15 years, whereas this is a lot more. So, does that mean it's failed? And are they embarrassed? Is there some other reason why it's never come out? Again, more questions than we can answer. But it's interesting to think, well, really by now it should have been unveiled, even if it's something that they just aren't working on anymore and then it just doesn't work properly. Diamond-shaped objects aren't unknown in ufology. Back in 1980, there's a so-called Cash Landrum case that happened in America, where two people and a child in a car had seen a diamond-shaped craft being escorted, as they said, by 30 or more helicopters. And they received some kind of effect from it, because they had what tantamount to radiation burns, without the radiation, of course, but it was like kind of a deep sunburn. And they were, and I think one person's eyesight was affected, and they took ages to recover. But that was a diamond-shaped craft. Now, the Calvine case doesn't have those after effects, but was it a kind of development from that craft, or was it something connected with it, or was it something that was something completely different? We just don't know. So again, lots of questions. No answers.
Do you think the MOD, the RAF, the UK government, any of these bodies are going to, I'm not going to say tell us everything, but are they even going to take this seriously and actually address it?
Well, our current questions, I mean, UAP Media, those of us who have actually contacted the MOD through our MPs, we've asked that question. Is this enough to warrant a case of defence significance? If not, why not? So we're pushing them for answers. We're not going to get them, presumably, because we've already had the kind of, one of my colleagues has had the boilerplate response about the 50 years of no defence significance line that they always trot out. But this is something different now. We actually have a photograph that proves there was something there, but what that was, nobody knows. And if the MOD are still maintaining this line, there's nothing to see here, move on, why is that the case when that was definitely there? Do they know it was there? And again, it's only hearsay, but there's this talk behind the scenes about a row that developed between the MOD and the Pentagon, saying, "Is that yours? No, is that yours?" Neither side, the other side, believing it was actually technology that the British invented without telling the Americans, and vice versa. And even worse, if the Americans are operating over British airspace and not telling the British, that's a bit of a no-no, really. So, again, more questions.
Yeah, whatever the truth is,
it's somewhere there, it's buried away. But will the MOD come out and say one day and say, "Look, that was this, and we don't know what it is," or it was something, and they come up with the name of it? Don't know.
Or maybe they'll just say it was the Americans. Ask them. We're not telling you anything else.
Well, that would be enough. Actually, Ben, that would be enough if they came forward and said, "It's an American project. We can't tell you what it was." That would be fine.
Yeah, it would. Give us something to go on. Talking of America and the UK and the difference, there obviously is a lot of secrecy still over there. There's still, whatever word we want to use, cover up, truth embargo, secrecy, lies, however we want to say it, there's something being kept under wraps, or some things being kept under wraps. However, the US does seem, very progressive compared to how things are going in the UK on this topic. Like it's quite frustrating where on the one hand in America you've got like NASA getting involved, you've got this topic, even if the hearings were a bit of a letdown in some ways, it's getting that spotlight. Whereas in the UK, I think the last time it came up in the House of Commons, it was, some baron or somebody from the Navy answering and just shutting down every question. Like, oh no, there's no significance. There's no, we shut down those because there's nothing to look at. And what I guess the question here is, do you think the UK are going to catch up anytime soon and actually start to address the topic? Or do you think we're going to continue to, run around and try and avoid it?
I think the UK has been very good at secrecy for years. I mean, we invented effectively military intelligence and how
stiff upper lip.
Well, yeah, it's been going for like over 100 years. The British invented military intelligence as a kind of tool to help a country in terms of to avert crisis or to mitigate potential conflicts, etc. So, and we're very good at it. We've been doing it for and we teach other countries. We taught the Americans how to actually set up an intelligence operation. When they founded the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the Americans came to the British to learn how to do it effectively. And then, of course, the OSS become the CIA. So it's not as if there's not precedent for the British being really good at keeping secrets. They do it for all sorts of things, but particularly this subject. The Americans not so. They're leaky. There's always somebody prepared to come along and say something off the record or even on the record occasionally. And of course, across there, the scale of the phenomenon is much bigger as well. So there's many more people involved in it for a longer period of time. The reports, and you can see intelligence documents, and they've got the Freedom of Information Act. The things have been put in the public realm much earlier and much easier than you can find them here. So there's a lot of scope for information to come out from America, whereas here, not so much. We're much better at the people who want to keep secrets are much more able to. They've got the tools to do it, and they've got the wherewithal and the motivation to do it, and just the history as well. So when you set us against the Americans in that respect, there's no comparison really. And if there's going to be any kind of breakthrough here, it's more likely to come from across the Atlantic.
Yeah, you think it would be them kind of taking a few more steps forward, which forces us to take one or maybe two steps?
Yeah, I think it's either there'll be something happens that can't be hidden for whatever reason, or somehow information comes out that can't be refuted and it leads to a conclusion, or they eventually just give up the game and go, yeah, okay, look, you win. This is happening. Or there's a change in policy as well. Of course, it could be something like that. This could be just a kind of legacy of year after year after year of secrecy, and maybe somebody else comes along, like a new person, and takes charge of something and has a completely different outlook on it and says, actually, now, guys, we need to just come clean on this. So there's all that. This side of the Atlantic, I don't think we've got that. We don't have a Lou Elizondo. We don't have a kind of whistleblower, who's prepared to come forward and say, I did this, I did that, I worked for that. I know we've got Nick Pope, but he's not in the same league. I mean, to be charitable, yes, okay, he took phone calls. He didn't actually go out in the field and investigate UFO cases. He took information that was phoned into him, and he passed it on to people or other departments in the RAF and the MOD that could investigate, or could come up with information. Much as Nick Pope wants to, I think, maybe set himself up as somebody who has expert knowledge on, the UFO phenomenon. He did basically just answer the phone and note down things and pass them on to other people. And his analysis doesn't really go much further beyond people who read books, to be fair. I mean, I don't have anything against the guy, but I think he might have been, exaggerated his kind of role more than it actually was. But he still has a unique insight because he was actually part of a department whose a small part of their function, and something that didn't happen every day, but a small part of his role was to take, information down about sightings from the general public. So that's more than other people have done.
Yeah, definitely. It's a funny world, isn't it? It's where you got like these people answering the questions on behalf of the UAP task force in the congressional hearings, and they
don't know anything.
I don't believe them. I don't believe them at all. But if you did believe them, they have less knowledge, than your average kind of hobby UFO.
Well, one was asked about Maelstrom in the 1970s,
exactly,
and he just had no. Well, I don't know if he knew where Maelstrom was.
I think his answer, he kind of indicated, I've heard rumor about that case, rumors and hearsay. But,
considering the case is actually in the US Air Force records, there's actually a report that was written for them. Then it's not. It's more than just a rumor.
And I believe Robert Saleh sent it to the UAP task force in the run up to those congressional hearings as well. So they got no excuse whatsoever. Absolute joke. So the language though as well in America has stepped up recently. I don't know if you've had any kind of thoughts on that. Like I was quite shocked to see I can't remember which document it was, but to see non-man-made UFOs referenced. What's your take on that? Do you think, it didn't feel like they were trying to hide behind weather, because obviously a weather phenomena could be a non-man-made UFO, UAP, I suppose, more than UFO. But yeah, what is your take on that kind of stepping up of language and what does it mean?
2017, when those 3 videos came out, and whilst there weren't kind of definitive proof of something extraordinary, I think there was enough information from there and also other things that came out at the time and since that the Department of Defense have been forced. They're on the back foot, basically. For years, they've had this kind of cozy arrangement where they could just point people back to Blue Book and say, look, there was this long-running program and nothing could be seen and nothing was found out, and everything that was, reported could be explained away. That only lasted for so long. Once you have these 3 videos and that one of the gimbal where the thing shifts around, then it's not incontrovertible, but it's enough to actually move people away from that default setting of nothing to see here, move on. And I think they've been forced down a kind of path where they may have not wanted to go down, but because of circumstances, they've been forced to come up with to set up a UAP task force, which then came up with a preliminary report, which its recommendations were that at the very least they provide a flight risk to naval aviators and to the wider aviation, sort of like side at large. So therefore, that demands a response. The Department of Defense then had to come up with, okay, we're going to set something up to look at it. So you can see the kind of road that maybe the DoD don't want to travel down, but they're being forced down it because to actually say otherwise, they're just going to get shot down because everybody, there's this not weight of evidence, but this weight of information and testimony and imagery and FLIR footage and all the rest of it. You can't just dismiss that out of hand with some kind of blithe comments about, well, yeah, but we've looked at that before in the past and there was nothing, or actually, no, we haven't got the time, or we don't think it's anything. That just doesn't wash anymore. And also the public, like them or loathe them, in some sections of it, they're much more sophisticated than they were. They're not that willing just to sit down and be force-fed, rubbish anymore. They can think for themselves. There's things all over people over social media who are quite good commentators, quite good analysis. There's people in the media now who are happy to dig into the subject. They're not prepared just to have it as the fringe, the last story on the news, or to make fun of it anymore. You don't hear the X-Files music around stories so much now, if at all. So, and I think because of the public reaction to it, the DoD and everybody else were forced to actually sort of grasp it and take it on board and treat it much more seriously. And that's reflected in the language as well. The language, as you meant, this is your question. The language is much more serious. It just seems that everything has been taken not for granted, that there's just something prosaic anymore. It's a mystery that needs to be solved. Now, that might be turn out some mundane explanations, but it might not as well.
Yeah. I just think they're so fascinating that they actually, that non-man-made UAP, I can't remember if it's UAP or UFO in that context.
UAP.
But I'm assuming probably UAP, non-man-made UAP, which is it's like opening a door ajar, which has just the door, which has everything in there. And then
you referred back to the hearings, the congressional hearings that they had before, and the lack of information. You can still see them, the 2 experts, and I'll put those, like that word in inverted commas. They were trying their level best to try and sort of dampen down the kind of, the feelings and the expectation, but also the actual scale of the problem. Because two videos they show, well, what do they show?
Yeah.
They show things which can be explained away, or, well, one that can be explained away, and the other one where there's enough room for them to come and say, well, it's just artifacts on a camera. They were the triangle, the bokeh, the triangle kind of like lights that were seen dancing around the US Navy ships. So in their minds, you can imagine if it's still the same mentality of they're trying to hide this or trying to put a lid on it, then the best thing you can do is come up with two videos which can be shot down in flames straight away. They're not going to show the good stuff. They're not going to show something that's so ambiguous or so kind of incontrovertible that you can go, yeah, okay, there's definitely something going on there. That's not going to appear until they're forced to put it in front of a congressional committee or the Senate or wherever. But behind closed doors, that's a different story. I'll lay money on that, some of that other stuff appearing there behind closed doors.
Do you think we'll get, this disclosure, this idealist idea of disclosure, whatever that might be? I don't think there is a disclosure, because there could be a whole, they could disclose 2/3 of the information. They could disclose 1/4 of it. They could disclose whatever they know, which may or may not be, more or less than those. We might. So what I'm saying is, there's not necessarily, disclosure, aliens are here. We might not know that. It might just be disclosure, there are UFOs. That might have already happened in that case. So do you think there's going to be some day that there's going to be big news dropping, or do you think it's going to be little breadcrumbs, like kind of bit by bit here and there?
In terms of the answer, it depends. Most people, it depends on how much information they have and how much they know. If they know everything and they know exactly what's happening, and there are, there's aliens coming to visit us and all the rest of it, and they have in the past, they're still doing it now, and they've got crash retrievals and all the rest of it, then that big D disclosure, it could happen in the future. But equally, and this is my personal take on it, and it's just my opinion for what it's worth, I don't think they're that far forward. I think they know that there's something there, but as to, the scale of it and what it is and where it's from, the motivation, I don't think they're much further forward than we are. I think they have information, but that information doesn't need a lot of knowledge or understanding. They'll have some inkling of, it's happened here, and we've got this information, we've got pictures which are, much better than maybe that we have as civilians. And they've got film footage, and they might even have wreckage. But there's something I'm fond of explaining to people. You go back in time and you give Sir Isaac Newton an iPhone, and then let the power run out. And then what's he got? He's got a slab of metal and glass, hasn't he? He can't recharge it because he hasn't got a charger. There's no electricity in 16 whatever anyway. There's no cell tower network, so he can't use it even if he could power it up. He's got no concept of what it is. Never mind the kind of what it does or what you use it for, all the apps and for playing music and all the rest of it, and maps, satellite technology and all the rest of it. It'd be completely beyond him. Now, the best thing to do would be to put it away for a bit and then come back 5 years later when you've got a little bit more knowledge and see whether you can understand it now. And I guess if the US Air Force and other people have material of some description, not wreckage or debris or even a complete craft, chances are they've gone through the same process. They've looked at things and they've put it away. Their experts go back to it every so often and see whether they can get any further forward, and chances are they still keep going back every so often until the day arrives where they have the knowledge to open it up. Maybe not be able to fly it, but they might just be able to get inside it if they've got a complete craft on their hands. And then sets the ball rolling about how long is it before you can understand how it works and how it's powered and all the rest of it. So in terms of disclosure, it depends on how far along the road they are to understanding as to what that disclosure is. And at the very least, it might just be a case of them saying, there's something happening, but we don't know what it is. But then does any country want to come forward and say, there's something happening which we have no control over? And how does that, sort of play with the citizens? If the Ministry of Defense or the Department of Defense came forward to Britain or America and said, there's something going on, but we can't do anything to stop it, what happens then? Panic in the streets?
You're absolutely right, but I think in a way they've almost kind of admitted that, haven't they? That there's something
but
happening,
the actual,
and we don't know what it is.
Remember the Queen's funeral when it was announced on BBC, the kind of world stopped for a lot of people. I mean, you may not have like stopped everything you're doing, but you had that kind of that moment when you went, oh, and then you just had to quickly thought about all the ramifications. Now scale that up to, the BBC News. Then Hugh Edwards comes on and says, the Ministry of Defence have announced that UFOs exist, but they can't do anything about them. Or it appears on NBC or ABC that the Americans, DOD, have announced that there's definitely something happening, but that their Air Force or their military are powerless to stop it. So then, people start complaining that their wives and their girlfriends and their kids are being abducted, or their animals are being mutilated and all the rest of it. And, aircraft are being threatened in the skies by things flying around and bumping into them occasionally, or people disappearing like Frederick Valentich. How does that play out with the media? And then you've got the religious aspect, the people who are, the end of the world is nigh, and are they demonic, and all this kind of stuff that's apparently appeared. People like reasons for people downplaying the scale of what's happening. You're going to get kind of like reaction from all sides. Is there going to be a run in the stock market? All this kind of stuff. And there'd be no end to it. And once you got the lid off, you can't put it back on again. So it might be a frightening time for a lot of people. People say they can deal with it, but can they really when it comes? The day came.
I'm the first one to admit. I'll say, my kind of line is that I think the truth should be shared with us. I think we should know. However, I reserve the right to say I regret saying that. If it comes out and it turns out they just want it, it's something here, and they just want to eat us, and they're just doing it one by one, and maybe I'd regret saying I wanted to know, but ultimately, coming from a place of not knowing, I think. Yeah. I like to think that I would share it with people if I was able to. But it's like you said, it's what do they know? Even the person that knows more than anybody else on planet Earth, how much do they know? I find it hard to believe, like you mentioned earlier, that they would know intention and motivation and things like that. I mean, who knows? They could, but I find that a stretch.
I guess it depends on also who you believe in terms of, because there's a history of contactees and people even in the 60s where the so-called space brothers were coming and talking to people and saying, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and we're going to be doing this, and we're going to appear. And none of that's happened. So you've got, and then of course, even like much like later on, you've got now what they don't call them abductees anymore. People are called experiencers, aren't they? And occasionally you'll get these same kind of prophecies that crop up. And I take those with a pinch of salt. I don't disbelieve the vast majority of experiences, because that's something I've got no frame of reference for, and therefore I can't say, look, you're not telling the truth. And I've got a default setting where I just think, okay, I'll believe what you're saying as you believe it yourself. But does it mean that people have the answers? I don't think it does. And I think at the end of the day, as you say, whoever has the most information, they probably know much further forward than we are. Which I think a lot of people might not be happy with in the UFO field, because there's a lot of people over the years who have kind of written books about this is the truth, and it's this, and they're from here, and they want that, and all the rest of it. And they're going to be sort of shown up to be complete charlatans, I'm afraid, if and when that truth does appear, because chances are it's going to be nothing like that, what they've said.
Yeah. One thing I do think that the truth will be more bizarre than most people maybe are ready for. I think that's it will challenge our view of reality in one way or another. Even people that are maybe into this topic, like people that are all read up on the possible links to this.
Will
topic.
It be the one where it's like it's going to be more sort of bizarre than we imagine, but not just that, but that we can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, it very much. Yeah, it could be. It just we just enter such speculative, realms when we begin to think about what it could all represent. Yeah. Because as I'm sure the further you go into the topic, as we said quite a few times now, the more questions that come up, the more little side roads you notice, like, oh, so maybe that road that goes down there, that actually could lead somewhere, in fact, that might not be made
Well, that's
up.
why I don't go into speculation, because I think it's just a series of rabbit holes which you have no proof and no evidence for. And yes, okay, you can extrapolate and you can pontificate and you can speculate as much as you like, but it doesn't get you anywhere, because you can come up with all these theories, but if you can't prove them, then you're no further forward. And they sound great, and you'll find that people do believe them and then spout them out as truth, but that's actually not what they are. And that's a shame as well, because unfortunately you are leading people down the garden path occasionally, and it's not fair on people, and especially when people like just treat it as verbatim, as fact. And I don't like that all the time. I'd rather people just stick to what they can prove. Yes, okay, put out theories as much as you like, but don't then treat them as being truth, because they're nowhere near truth. Just because somebody comes up with something that sounds plausible doesn't mean to say it is, and it could be something that we just simply haven't considered yet. Can't rule anything out.
No, absolutely. So in terms of whether there could be something otherworldly or non-human behind all this, I gather that you are open to that possibility. What case would you say, if you could pick one off the top of your head? Obviously, I haven't given you this as homework, so you might change your mind later. You might be like, oh, I should have taken a different case. But can you think of one case that you would say you think is a strong case for there being something otherworldly or non-human going on at the moment?
Well, that's interesting, because it's just a general kind of slew of cases, not just one. I think if you look at a few, so you look at the Travis Walton abduction case. You look at that, and the Pascagoula case for abductions. Then those have this extraterrestrial element. But then again, you look at ones like Socorro in 1964 about the strange craft, and these two, they were very small beings, they're almost like children who were flying that thing. There's that particular case. But then also the Westall 66, the school in Australia where the children saw the strange craft that came down and flew off. The Flatwoods Monster case of that strange kind of robot kind of thing that was appearing in oil spewing from it going through the trees. That doesn't seem to be anything that appears to have been made on Earth at all. So there's just a whole... there's so many cases. When you add them up together, it seems like it seems to lean towards that. But then again, there could be more prosaic answers for it all, and it might all be explained away in earthly terms. But the weight of evidence seems to be pushing towards something else. But I'm not ready yet. So definitely that. I know many people do, but I'm still quite a bit happy just to wait and see, because I've got patience. I'm quite happy reading it. I'm quite happy talking about it. I'm quite happy writing it. But I'm not prepared to just throw my hat in the ring and go, it's definitely aliens. I'm going to write about aliens. I'm going to say they're aliens. They're coming from Zeta Reticuli, and that's exactly what this all is. And I've been here, and I'm being right all these years, all this kind of stuff. That's not me.
No, you're going to bide your time. That makes sense. But no, I agree with you on the sense that it's kind of the general. It's the accumulation of cases. And one of the aspects that for me is most compelling that it could be something non-human is just simply the dates of when these things happened. Like when you go back and say, okay, so that happened in the 40s, 70s, or even, hundreds of years ago. It's like, okay, so maybe if it happened now, I'd be saying, that's pretty much certain that that's going to be technology of... But no, when it happened back then, it goes the other way. And it's like, okay, I'm almost certain, like 99.9%, that couldn't have been a human technology. So either you've got all these witnesses who were drunk and lying and in cahoots, or something bizarre took place. Tell me a little bit about, just for a couple of minutes, just tell me a little bit about UAP Media UK. You mentioned earlier you're kind of, I don't know what your term would be, you're affiliated with, or you're an ambassador for.
I'm a member of the group, basically, that's all.
Member of the group of UAP Media UK. Yeah, tell me a little bit about the group and what kind of the goals are and things like that.
So we're a kind of a collection of artists and podcasters and authors who basically got together just to try and bring a more kind of a sensible approach to try and investigating this. And we act as we'll set ourselves up as a kind of bridge between the media, politicians, and the public, because we've seen the kind of reporting that's in the British press. You know, it is the kind of X-Files, kind of sensationalized, and sometimes lack of actual information in terms of hard information and actual truth in terms of the historical record. So we want to try and get away from that and maybe steer the press more towards, actual evidence and towards truthful reporting, and rather than sensationalized reporting. So getting away from my partner was abducted and turned into a crisp kind of thing, and to much more sensible and more kind of believable reportage. So we wanted that, and also so we basically got in touch with a lot of reporters. And so we're now, like a go-to, if you like, for when they want comments on stories. And of course, there might be sensational stories, but we then try and provide a more grounded kind of, sort of part of that story. So it brings it back onto the straight level. But also, we're trying to be a point of contact for people in Parliament or politicians to try and talk to as well, to try and get some kind of dialogue going, rather than just have this kind of, approaching the MOD and then coming back with a boilerplate response. We want a bit more of a dialogue than that. So we have that as well. And of course, we also push politicians as well for answers. So we have that. But individually, we push the subject forward to the general population, and not just people who are interested in UFOs, by kind of artwork, by books, by podcasts, and we all either link in together or we go our separate ways and have separate projects, but we work together on collaborations and each other's projects as well, so that people come across our work. Then, if they want to know more, then there's a wide variety of information they can get involved in and to read. And we like to think that it's all, sort of straightforward, but it's also truthful. We're not pushing wild theories. We're not pushing narratives. We're not trying to give out information that we know is not true. We do back it up with evidence. And of course, now you mentioned Calvine before, we investigate things as well.
Yeah, awesome. Have you got anywhere with the UK politicians and members of Parliament?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's
personally or the group.
A lot of it happens just behind the scenes, by us talking to people or by sending letters, sending emails, and the rest of it. And it's mostly a waiting game. So from the MOD, you'll get the standard responses, but actually from MPs, you get a little bit more sometimes. So in their replies, when they say, that they've passed information on to the MOD, or they've got information back, and here it is, there'll be little bits of extra information they put in, like, how they think it's interesting, or they haven't heard of that before, but this is intriguing. So it's not like a kind of flat denial or a flat refusal to believe stuff. And actually, you find that sometimes when you sort of contact them a bit more at length, they're more open to, the possibilities of whatever things are than just, there's nothing to see here, move on. And that's the basis for a future contact. So it's a question of just doing it quite gently, quite slowly, quite gradually, not a kind of in your face, do you believe in aliens kind of thing? Because you're guaranteed that if you do that, you're going to get a negative response. Whereas if you do it more slowly and just building up a conversation and coming up with much more, kind of rational arguments, then there's less room for people to just respond negatively to you. So that's the way we do it, and we're doing it, more sensibly rather than just quite sensationally.
Cool. Yeah, it makes sense. I guess one of the challenges is that, especially in the UK, especially recently with the the Conservative leadership race and all that, it's become abundantly clear, if it wasn't already, that the seemingly top priority above everything else is winning the next election, the proverbial next election, and that obviously is, they're all going to see this as a risky topic, the same as loads of other things that should be happening, such as changing the policy on drugs. The war on drugs clearly was a failure many years ago, and it's a waste of police time, money, everything. Why would we not be taking a more liberal move forward? But it's, again, they're afraid of the repercussions.
I think the way we look at it is, though, because we're quite pragmatic. So we think if we can get the press to be more serious about the reporting, if we can get people on board, people, our contacts in the States, people like Lou Elizondo, like Sean Cahill, as you mentioned before, who come across as much more credible because they either have experience or just the way their language and the way they conduct themselves. They're considered to be much more credible, much more serious. If we can get people like that on board, if we can get the reporting much better than it has been, less sensationalized, less clickbaity, much more evidence driven, and serious commenting on what's happening, then we're in a much better position to actually have influenced politicians to, especially the ones who are much more predisposed to actually commenting, to come out and actually, come up with stuff which we can use, and they're not seen as being sort of like kind of being very, very wild and out there and coming out with strange statements which can be rubbished by the press. Because if the press are on board already and they're being more serious about it, then they're less likely to attack when somebody just come out and say something which could otherwise be by class as being controversial. So I think we're just setting the groundwork for this. It's going to be a slow process. We know that. We're not expecting the results overnight. We're not that kind of people. But we do, we've got a kind of long-term outlook that we're prepared to put the hours in, prepared to put the work in. And yes, we know it's not going to happen overnight, but it'll happen at some stage. And we just need a few. We don't need many people. We just need a few people to come forward in various places to set the ball rolling. So that's where we're coming from.
Cool. Yeah, step by step, and like you say, you got to bide your time a little bit, and hopefully the general. I mean, it's already changing, isn't it? We can all feel the general feeling towards this. The sentiment is changing. It's evolving. I tell you what, we need to get Lou Elizondo this morning.
You do,
and some daytime TV shows in the UK, and get Holly Willoughby being like, oh my gosh, what's what?
Well, if he opens up to a bigger audience, to a wider audience who might actually take something from it, then I'll be all for that.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be great. Just to change tact a little bit here before we kind of wrap this up, Graeme. I wanted to get your thoughts just in brief on a couple of other topics that I kind of focus on, explore, discuss for this podcast. So firstly, and again, obviously, if you haven't researched them or looked into them at all, then I understand that, and I don't expect you to give me too much here. But firstly, on alleged psychic phenomena, anomalous cognition, and on the other hand, and I suppose consciousness, you can kind of put in there as well. And the other hand is the potential survival of consciousness, so any kind of life after death. Have you had any kind of have you looked into either of those sides of things at all?
I can remember reading about these things off and on in the past. In terms of personal experience, I have none. In terms of researching it, I've got no experience of doing so, and therefore my conclusions are that I can't rule any of it out. And because this is so beyond people's knowledge in terms of general knowledge, it ends up as being fringe science, if you like, doesn't it? So therefore, it's information that people are probably not going to spend, or a majority of mainstream scientists aren't going to spend too much time and money and whatever looking at. But that doesn't mean to say there's nothing real there. And I think like UFOs, we don't have enough information to be able to rule it out and say, oh, it's either people making things up or it's something we can explain in rational and mundane terms. So I think it would be very unfair to write off people and the experiences without much more knowledge and much more investigation. That hopefully that investigation would lead to knowledge. And I would welcome that. Again, I'm not somebody who not necessarily has an interest in it, but has too much experience in looking at it. But if something came forward that actually went, there's definitely something to this, we just need more, I'll be very interested in reading that.
Yeah, there is actually loads of stuff that's been done. It's just it's so hidden. It's kind of hidden. To quote Ross Coulthard's book title, it's hidden in plain sight. Until about a year ago, I thought psychic phenomena and all of it was absolute nonsense. Like if you'd said to me about any of it, oh Ben, what do you think about telepathy, or what do you think about remote viewing or precognition, I would have just been like, no, I just don't think it's real. I just don't. I haven't looked into it, but I don't. Anyway, I ended up going down a kind of a bit of a research rabbit hole, which started with one of Leslie Kane's books, Surviving Death, actually. And I went down that road and then went into a book called The Conscious Universe by Dr. Dean Radin. And I just kind of continuously getting my mind blown for like a few months, just day after day, just like, whoa. And it kind of over the course of a few months, it changed my worldview. I guess it's fair to say. I don't have a strict opinion on these things in terms of I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly what is possible and anything like that. but there's significant evidence to suggest that it is real. That these things.
Well, I think
it's
a good way to do it. If you're looking at something that you don't necessarily understand fully, you have to be able to change your opinion after more information comes in. Otherwise, you'd end up like just on the wrong side of the argument. You mentioned telepathy there, and things like remote viewing. When I first heard about that, and this is quite a long time ago, remote viewing, and it was like one of those concepts where you just go, what?
Yeah.
And then, but when you do read a bit more, I heard a bit more about the Americans looking at it and setting up a program to look at it more generally. And I think the Russians did as well, because they'd be quite interested in that kind of thing, because the Russians were good at maybe looking at things that might not have gone anywhere, just in case there's that remote possibility that it might have worked.
Yeah,
both sides of the Cold War looking at things like that. There must have been something to it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have invested so much time and money and effort in doing so. So yeah, intriguing. Definitely intriguing. If I had more time, I'd be looking into these things, I think.
That's what I would say to you. I know how much there is in the UFO side of things, and obviously you have your other interests and your family and everything, but there's not enough time in the day, is there? I just think it's so fascinating. All three of these things, the UFOs, the anomalous cognition, and what's the deal with consciousness and the brain and all that kind of stuff, and then what happens when we die, like one of the biggest questions ever. I just think that's so fascinating, and I will say that there's way more out there on it, and scientific research and anecdotal research, everything. There's so much more than most people would believe, most people would realize. It's amazing, really. But I'm glad to hear you're open and interested by it.
Even things like cryptids, Bigfoot and other kind of things that have been seen. It's one of those things you can't rule out until either you can or you can't with more information. So there's a lot out there that's unexplained that people are fascinated in, and it is a question of like just having the time and the ability to be able to look into them as much as people can. But
Bigfoot's one that I haven't really found the time to look into in any great detail. I certainly am kind of open to the possibility. It sounds a lot less insane when you go down the line of Bigfoot this. If you say, is it possible that there's a species of great ape that's in tiny numbers and spread sporadically throughout the world that have somehow clung on in these small pockets? Yeah, even Dr. Jane Goodall admitted in an interview that it's possible, and that why not? There could be.
They always like to put little cozy names to these things. So that's where the Bigfoot name came from, isn't it? But But
it's got so many names across the world as well.
Very true. Yeah. So there's a whole range of things that even if you're not that fussed about UFOs, or you are and you've got spare capacity, there's a lot to get into. And I think people do sometimes start with one of these things. Like yourself, but then you move into other areas and you find that actually you have more interest in those than you did in where you started from. So that's great. And
I was originally very anti-woo. I was very like UFOs, and I'm like, don't want to go into anything that's not nuts and bolts. And I intentionally kind of stayed into the really hard stuff, and then by reading the research on these other related or semi-related topics, it kind of, I had to relook at it and go, actually, all that stuff that I thought was woo actually wasn't woo. It was just stuff that we still don't understand. It's like, supernatural is just natural.
It's just natural without explanation.
Paranormal is just normal. We just need to understand more, hopefully with time. I'm going to let you get going, Graeme. I really appreciate your time today. This was a lot of fun. This was fascinating. And I can't wait to read your books whenever I find the time.
Thank you.
And they'll all be in the description, all the links to all those and anything else. Is there any kind of last words or sentiment or message you want to pass to anybody watching or listening? Could be anything.
I think if people are on Facebook, don't treat everything you read as gospel. Dig into things, but that goes to the things that people put on Twitter and in books and magazines, etc. Don't just take things as read. Do your own investigations as much as you can into looking at stories and events and cases that come up, and build your own picture up, make your own mind up, and that's the best thing I can say to people.
Yeah, solid advice. And I'd add to it and say include even the mainstream news these days. I really do think you have to vet everything and check everything, because one person's truth, it doesn't mean it's a lie, but there's another angle to truth, always. Yeah. Again, really appreciate it, Graeme. I wish you all the best of luck with your books, and I look forward to seeing all the ones that are to come. And hopefully we'll talk again at some point in the future.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to my conversation with Graeme Rendall. I hope you had fun and learned some new things along the way. Please check out the links in the description for Graeme's books and much more. Please subscribe to continue unraveling the universe with us.